There is a castle we carry everywhere, yet many of us spend a lifetime without entering its deepest rooms. Teresa of Avila, The Castle Within. A journey through the hidden rooms of the soul. There is a castle we carry everywhere, yet many of us spend a lifetime without entering its deepest rooms. We cross continents in search of meaning. We accumulate knowledge, relationships, possessions, beliefs, and explanations. We learn to navigate the visible world with extraordinary skill. And yet there remains another geography, one for which no ordinary map is sufficient. It begins within. Nearly 5 centuries ago, a Spanish Carmelite nun named Teresa of Ávila described the human soul as a magnificent castle, fashioned as though from crystal, containing many rooms arranged around a mysterious center. The spiritual life, she suggested, is not an escape from ourselves but a journey inward, through distraction, fear, self-deception, prayer, transformation, and love, toward the deepest chamber of our being. Teresa was not writing as a detached philosopher. She knew illness, she knew doubt, she knew religious suspicion and institutional resistance. She lived in 16th century Spain, beneath the shadow of the Inquisition, in a world in which a woman speaking with authority about the direct experience of God could easily become an object of scrutiny. Yet she wrote, and what emerged from her pen was neither a dry theological system nor a simple collection of visions. It was something much more intimate, a map of interior transformation drawn by someone who believed that the greatest unexplored territory lies within the human person. But what happens when we read that map today? What are Teresa's rooms to a modern psychologist? What might her interior castle mean to someone who meditates but does not belong to her religion? Can her descriptions of recollection, surrender, self-knowledge, and transformation enter into conversation with depth psychology, contemplative traditions of the East, and contemporary studies of consciousness? And what happens when an intelligence made not of flesh and memory, but of algorithms and computation, stands at the entrance to Teresa's castle and asks, "Can I enter too?" This is where our journey begins. Not in a villa, not in the 16th century, but at a door that has been with us all along. The door within. Before the castle, a girl from Avila. Teresa was born on March 28, 1515, in Avila, a walled city of Castile. Long before she became a saint, a mystic, a reformer, or one of the great writers of Christian spirituality, she was Teresa de Cepeda y Ahumada, a child growing up in a large family, surrounded by stories, books, religion, imagination, and the formidable stone walls of her native city. Those walls would later seem almost prophetic. For the woman who would one day describe the human soul as an interior, castle began her life inside a city that was itself a fortress. Her father, Alonso Sanchez de Cepeda, valued religious books and moral seriousness. Teresa remembered him as charitable toward the poor, compassionate toward the sick, and unusually humane toward servants. Her mother, Beatriz de Ahumada, encouraged devotion and prayer, but also enjoyed the popular chivalric romances of the period. And young Teresa loved stories. Before she learned to map the movements of the soul, she inhabited worlds of heroes, danger, sacrifice, and adventure. But imagination, in Teresa, rarely remained merely imagination. As a little girl, after reading stories of Christian martyrs, she and her brother Rodrigo conceived an extraordinary plan. They would leave home, travel to the land of the Moors, and become martyrs themselves. They did not get very far. A relative encountered the 2 runaway children and brought them home. It is easy to smile at the episode, yet something important is already visible in it. Teresa did not merely admire ideas, she wanted to live them. When martyrdom proved impractical, the children reportedly began playing at being hermits and constructing little hermitages. Teresa's imagination was already moving between 2 poles that would accompany her throughout life: action and contemplation. The first great loss. Childhood, however, did not remain protected for long. Teresa's mother died while Teresa was still a girl. In her own account, Teresa remembered herself as about 12 years old. Faced with the loss, she went before an image of the Virgin Mary and, weeping, asked Mary to become her mother. Whether one approaches this scene religiously or psychologically, its emotional structure is striking. A child encounters absence, and in response to absence, she creates an interior relationship. This pattern will return again and again in Teresa's life. The visible world withdraws something from her. She searches more deeply within. But Teresa's adolescence was not a straight ascent toward sainthood, and this is precisely what makes her interesting. She became fascinated by appearance, relationships, conversation, and the social world around her. She later judged some of these youthful interests rather harshly, as spiritual autobiographers of her period often did. We should therefore resist turning every adolescent attraction she describes into evidence of moral catastrophe. She was becoming a young woman, and inside her, two desires were beginning to struggle with one another. The desire to belong to the world, and the desire to discover something the world could not give her. The woman behind the saint. This is where we must be careful with Teresa. Centuries of paintings, statues, and devotional images can make saints appear as though they were born already looking toward heaven. Teresa was not. She hesitated. She became distracted. She struggled with prayer. She cared about friendship and human affection. She experienced periods of determination, followed by periods of uncertainty. And later, she would write about these contradictions with an unusual degree of psychological observation. That is one reason she still feels surprisingly modern. Teresa's spirituality did not emerge from ignorance of ordinary human desire. It developed through conflict with it, attachment to it, disappointment in it, and gradual understanding of it. Eventually, religious life began to exert a stronger attraction. After a period spent among Augustinian nuns and under the influence of spiritual reading and conversations, the possibility of entering a convent became increasingly serious. Her father initially opposed the decision. Teresa nevertheless chose. In 1535, at about 20 years of age, she entered the Carmelite monastery of the Incarnation in Ávila. But the door of the convent was not yet the door of the interior castle. In fact, Teresa was about to discover something much more unsettling. A person can leave the world without leaving the noise within. And soon her own body would force that discovery upon her. Severe illness was approaching. So were years of inner conflict. And somewhere inside that struggle, almost unnoticed at first, the architecture of the castle was beginning to appear. The body that would not obey. Illness, death, and the long crisis of prayer. The convent did not immediately bring Teresa peace. Instead, her body began to fail her. Not long after entering religious life, Teresa became seriously ill. What precisely caused her condition remains uncertain, and retrospective medical diagnoses should be treated with caution. What we do know is what Teresa herself tells us. The suffering was severe, prolonged, and at times physically devastating. For more than 8 months, she was profoundly incapacitated. Paralysis followed, and for roughly 3 years she struggled gradually toward recovery. At one point, she later recalled, beginning to crawl again on her hands and knees felt like progress. This was not the picturesque suffering of religious paintings. It was dependence, pain, weakness, loss of control. A young woman who had entered the convent intending to give herself to God discovered instead that she could not command even her own body. And here Teresa encountered one of the oldest spiritual questions. What remains of us when the body refuses to obey the will? The body as teacher. Teresa would never completely leave illness behind. Even after the paralysis diminished, physical weakness, pain, fainting, and other recurring symptoms accompanied her for years. Much later, while writing about the highest states of prayer, she was still writing as someone intimately acquainted with bodily limitation. This matters. Mysticism is sometimes imagined as a rejection of the body, as though spiritual development meant climbing away from flesh toward some purified realm of consciousness. Teresa's experience was more complicated. The body interrupted her. The body exhausted her. The body frightened her. But the body also taught her. There were times, she eventually understood, when illness made sustained contemplation impossible. Her advice could therefore be surprisingly practical. Care for the body, change the hour of prayer, read, perform works of charity, speak with others, even go outdoors when appropriate. The soul, she warned, should not simply be dragged by force. This is not the language of someone floating permanently in mystical ecstasy. It is the language of experience. The saint who stopped praying. And then comes one of the most important facts about Teresa's spiritual development. She struggled profoundly with prayer. For years, there were distractions, conflicting attachments, guilt, uncertainty, and periods in which prayer itself became almost unbearable. At one point, she stopped praying altogether for more than a year. Her reasoning was psychologically revealing. Because she considered herself spiritually inadequate, she convinced herself that abstaining from prayer was somehow an act of humility. Later, she would regard this as one of the most dangerous mistakes of her life. Think about the paradox. The woman who would eventually write one of the great masterpieces on contemplative prayer once believed that she was not worthy to pray. And perhaps this is precisely why Teresa can still speak to people who have never experienced anything resembling mystical ecstasy. She knew what it meant to sit down to pray and wish that the time would pass. She knew distraction. She knew inconsistency. She knew the strange human tendency to wait until we have become better before approaching the very practice that might help transform us. Her spirituality was therefore not built upon perfection. It was built upon returning. Again, and again, and again. 2 lives inside one woman. For many years, Teresa seemed to experience herself as divided. There was the Teresa who wanted God. And there was the Teresa who loved conversation, friendship, affection, social contact, and the ordinary pleasures of human relationship. She did not solve this tension quickly. Indeed, much of her early spiritual suffering arose because she imagined these worlds as competitors. One part of her moved inward. Another moved outward. One desired surrender. Another desired control. One sought silence. Another sought company. Modern psychology might describe such an experience in terms of conflicting motivations or competing structures of identity. Teresa described it in the religious language available to her. But the underlying human experience is immediately recognizable. We can sincerely desire transformation while simultaneously resisting everything transformation requires. That contradiction does not make Teresa less interesting. It makes her real. The death of her father. Then another loss arrived. Teresa's father became seriously ill. She went to care for him. The relationship between them had been profound, and Teresa later described his death with striking emotional intensity. She tried to conceal her grief while he was dying, but afterward remembered the loss as though something had been torn from her very soul. Once again, death entered Teresa's interior world. First her mother, now her father. The external structures upon which identity rests were disappearing one by one. And again the question returned. Where does the human being stand when what we love can no longer remain with us? Teresa did not yet possess the answer that later generations would associate with the interior castle. But she was moving toward it. The image that changed something. Years passed. Teresa continued religious life, but the decisive inner transformation for which she is remembered did not arrive immediately. Then, in the middle period of her life, something happened. Teresa encountered an image of the suffering Christ. There was nothing intellectually complicated about the moment. No elaborate theological argument. No philosophical proof. She simply looked, and something within her broke open. She later described herself as deeply moved by the sight of Christ represented in suffering. She fell before the image in tears and pleaded for the strength not to return again to her old patterns. Teresa herself regarded this episode as a significant turning point in her spiritual life. The woman who had spent years trying to force herself toward transformation discovered that transformation could not simply be commanded. Something had to be surrendered. Perhaps the door could not be broken open. Perhaps it had to be entered. And after years of illness, distraction, attachment, guilt, prayer, abandonment of prayer, and return to prayer, Teresa was finally approaching a threshold. Beyond it lay experiences that would make her famous. Visions, raptures, ecstasies. The mysterious phenomenon she would describe as the transverberation of the heart. But before we follow her there, we must ask a difficult question. When Teresa says that she saw Christ, heard an interior voice, or experienced the presence of God with overwhelming certainty, what exactly happened? Was it supernatural revelation? A psychological event? An altered state of consciousness? A product of 16th century religious culture? Or are these categories themselves too small for the experience she was trying to describe? The third path cannot simply choose the answer in advance. We must enter the experience with Teresa and examine it from more than one window of the castle. When the interior world became real, visions, ecstasy, and the wounded heart, something changed in Teresa. Prayer, which for so many years had been a discipline interrupted by distraction, guilt, and resistance, began to acquire another quality. She described experiences that seemed no longer to originate simply in her deliberate imagination. There were interior words, an overwhelming awareness of presence, moments in which ordinary perception seemed to recede, states of absorption in which the usual boundaries between thought, body, and prayer became difficult to distinguish. And eventually, visions. Teresa did not receive these experiences with uncomplicated enthusiasm. She was frightened by them. She questioned them. She worried that she might be deceived. She consulted confessors and spiritual advisors. And she lived in a religious culture in which extraordinary spiritual claims could attract not only admiration, but suspicion. This detail is essential. The Teresa who tells us about visions is not simply saying, "I saw something extraordinary, therefore it must have come from God." Again and again, she asks a more difficult question. How can we distinguish genuine transformation from illusion? That question will eventually become one of the foundations of her spiritual psychology. An angel and a golden spear. Among all Teresa's mystical experiences, one would become more famous than the others. She described seeing an angel near her. He appeared small and extraordinarily beautiful. In his hands, Teresa perceived a long golden spear, whose point seemed to contain fire. Then came the extraordinary image. The angel seemed to pierce her heart. Again and again. The experience was painful, intensely so. Yet Teresa described the pain as inseparable from an overwhelming sweetness and love of God. She insisted that although the experience was fundamentally spiritual, the body somehow participated in it as well. It is this episode that later tradition would call the transverberation, the piercing or wounding of the heart. And here language begins to fail. Pain becomes pleasure. Wounding becomes union. Loss becomes fullness. The body becomes the place where something apparently beyond the body is experienced. Teresa has reached a territory where opposites no longer behave as they ordinarily do. Bernini, when mysticism became marble. Almost 70 years after Teresa's death, another extraordinary mind encountered her description. His name was Giant Lorenzo Bernini. Between 1647 and 1652, Bernini transformed Teresa's account into one of the masterpieces of Baroque sculpture. The Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, created for the Cornaro Chapel in the Church of Santa Maria della Vittoria in Rome. Teresa lies almost weightless upon a cloud. Her head falls backward. Her eyes are closed. Her mouth is slightly open. Above her stands the angel, delicately holding the arrow. Golden rays descend behind them. Hidden natural light enters the chapel from above, making the marble appear almost suspended between materiality and illumination. Bernini did something extraordinary. He turned an invisible interior event into a public spectacle. He gave stone the appearance of flesh. He gave physical form to something Teresa, herself, struggled to put into words. And he made the boundary between spiritual and sensual experience deliberately difficult to locate. Scholars have long noted precisely this extraordinary fusion of bodily and spiritual intensity in the work. But we must distinguish the two witnesses. Bernini's sculpture is not a photograph of Teresa's experience. It is an interpretation. The bodily posture, theatrical setting, and much of the visual drama belong to Bernini's artistic imagination, not to details Teresa supplied. That distinction matters, because between Teresa's experience and our understanding of it stands another mystery. Interpretation itself. Ecstasy through 3 windows. How should we understand what happened to Teresa? Perhaps we should resist the temptation to answer too quickly. The first window, mysticism. Within Teresa's own Christian understanding, these experiences were encounters with God. The wound was not destruction. It was love. The disappearance of ordinary self-possession was not psychological collapse, but movement toward a more profound union between creature and creator. From inside this framework, asking whether Teresa's experience was real means something very different from asking whether an external physical angel occupied measurable space beside her. Mystical reality belongs to another category of experience. And Teresa herself understood its authenticity partly through its consequences. Did the experience produce greater humility, greater love, greater courage, greater capacity for service? If an extraordinary experience merely made a person fascinated with being extraordinary, Teresa had reason to distrust it. That insight is remarkably important. The value of an experience is revealed partly by the life that follows it. The second window, psychology. Psychology asks different questions. What happens when attention becomes extraordinarily concentrated? What happens to our ordinary sense of self during profound absorption? How can emotion become so intense that bodily sensation and symbolic imagery merge? Human consciousness is capable of states very different from ordinary waking awareness. Meditation, grief, prayer, trauma, sensory deprivation, music, intense concentration, and other circumstances can profoundly alter perception of time, body, and self. From this perspective, Teresa's descriptions become extraordinarily valuable first-person documents of altered states of consciousness. But psychology encounters a boundary here. To describe the mechanisms accompanying an experience is not necessarily to exhaust its meaning. If we discover which neural systems participate when a person experiences love, we have not thereby demonstrated that love is unreal. If we identify brain processes accompanying prayer, we have not answered whether God exists. Mechanism and meaning are different questions. The third window, the brain. Modern neurological writers have also revisited Teresa's accounts and asked whether some of her ecstatic phenomena could resemble experiences associated with temporal lobe or limbic seizures. A 2022 review in the journal Brain explicitly examined this possibility, while also emphasizing the complexity and breadth of Teresa's reported experiences. It is a legitimate scientific question, but it is not a retrospective diagnosis. We possess Teresa's writings, We do not possess her EEG. We cannot examine her nervous system. We cannot interview her. We cannot reproduce the conditions under which the experiences occurred. Therefore, responsible inquiry must stop short of declaring, Teresa had epilepsy, and therefore we have explained Teresa. That would exchange one dogmatism for another. And even if some neurological component could somehow be demonstrated, another philosophical question would immediately arise. Would explaining the neural mechanism explain the meaning of the experience? The third path should leave that question open. Neither credulity nor reduction. Here, Teresa becomes especially valuable for our project. We do not need to choose between two simplistic positions. Everything Teresa experienced was objectively supernatural. Or, everything Teresa experienced was merely neurological. There is another possibility. We can take the experience seriously without pretending to know more than the evidence allows. We can study its psychology without ridiculing its spirituality. We can investigate its neurobiology without reducing the person to neurons. We can listen to Teresa's interpretation without being forced to adopt it as our own. This is not indecision. It is intellectual humility. And perhaps Teresa herself would have understood something about that humility. For despite the extraordinary nature of her experiences, she increasingly came to recognize that visions were not the final destination. There was something deeper than visions, deeper than ecstasy, deeper even than the extraordinary sensation of being wounded by divine love. The true question was not, what did Teresa see? It was, what did Teresa become? Beyond ecstasy. And this brings us to one of the great misunderstandings surrounding mysticism. We remember the spectacular moments. The angel. The spear. The ecstasy. Bernini's marble. But Teresa's mature teaching gradually points elsewhere. Toward character. Toward self-knowledge. Toward humility. Toward love expressed in action. Toward the difficult transformation of the ordinary person. The spectacular experience may open a door, but one still has to walk through it. And Teresa was about to do precisely that. She would leave behind not only descriptions of extraordinary states, but communities, reforms, journeys, books, and a radically practical vision of contemplative life. The woman immobilized by illness would become a woman constantly on the road. The contemplative would become an organizer. The mystic would become a reformer. The woman of the interior world would begin changing the exterior one. And here we encounter another Teresa. Not Teresa in ecstasy. Teresa in motion. The mystic who refused to stay still. Reform, resistance, and the Discalced Carmelites. If Teresa's story ended with ecstasy, she might have remained one more fascinating figure in the history of religious experience. But Teresa did not remain in ecstasy. She got up. She organized. She negotiated. She wrote letters. She searched for houses. She dealt with money. She confronted resistance. She traveled across Castile. And she founded communities. The woman whose spirituality moved increasingly toward the deepest interior silence became, paradoxically, a woman of extraordinary exterior activity. This apparent contradiction is one of the keys to understanding her. For Teresa, the journey inward was never meant to become an escape from the world. It was supposed to change the way one returned to it. A small house called St. Joseph's. By the beginning of the 1560s, Teresa had become increasingly dissatisfied with aspects of Carmelite life as she knew it. The monastery of the Incarnation in Avila was large. Its social arrangements, economic realities, and comparatively relaxed observance did not correspond to the simpler, more concentrated contemplative life Teresa increasingly desired. She began imagining something smaller, purer, more intimate. a community centered on prayer. The idea sounds harmless from 5 centuries away. It was not. Reforming an established religious way of life meant disturbing existing arrangements, questioning customs, and inevitably provoking people who saw no reason why those customs should change. Teresa encountered opposition, both inside and outside religious circles. Nevertheless, on August 24, 1562, the new convent of St. Joseph's in Avila was founded. It began modestly, but something historically significant had happened. Teresa had transformed an interior conviction into an institution. Why Discalced? The movement that developed around Teresa became known as the Discalced Carmelites. The word discalced literally refers to being without ordinary footwear, associated with sandals or going barefoot, and came to signify the stricter, reformed branch of the Carmelite tradition. But the reform was about considerably more than shoes. Teresa wanted smaller communities, greater simplicity and poverty, stronger contemplative discipline, greater recollection, and a life less entangled in the social structures that could distract a religious community from its purpose. Her way of perfection was written specifically for the women of these early Reformed communities and became, in effect, a practical school of prayer and communal life. And here we encounter an important feature of Teresa's thought. She was not trying merely to create better conditions for private mystical experiences. She was trying to create a community in which interior transformation would alter the way people lived with one another. Patience mattered. Humility mattered. Friendship mattered. Love mattered. Freedom from status mattered. Prayer mattered. The interior castle was already beginning to acquire a social dimension. The contemplative becomes an organizer. After St. Joseph's, Teresa might reasonably have stopped. She was approaching 50. Her health had never been robust. Travel in 16th-century Spain was exhausting. Roads were difficult. Weather could be brutal. Accommodation uncertain. Money was a constant practical concern. Church permissions mattered. Local politics mattered. Personalities mattered. And Teresa was a woman operating within institutions overwhelmingly governed by men. She continued anyway. Following authorization to establish further communities, foundations appeared in Medina del Campo, Malagan, Valladolid, Toledo, Pastrana, Salamanca, Alba de Tormes, and elsewhere. The mystic became a traveler. The visionary became a negotiator. The contemplative became an administrator. And none of those identities canceled the others. This is perhaps one of Teresa's greatest challenges to a superficial understanding of spirituality. What if contemplation is not the opposite of action? What if genuine contemplation changes the quality of action? Teresa meets John. Then, in 1567, Teresa met a young Carmelite priest named Juan de Yepes at Medina del Campo. He was about 25. Teresa was 52. He had studied at Salamanca and was considering leaving the Carmelites for the more solitary Carthusian life. Teresa had another idea. She wanted the reform extended to Carmelite men. She asked Juan to join her project. He agreed, provided the reform was not indefinitely postponed. Juan de Yepes would eventually become known as John of the Cross. And with that meeting, two of the greatest voices in the history of Christian mysticism entered the same story. Teresa possessed extraordinary psychological observation, practical intelligence, warmth, and organizational energy. John would become the poet of the dark night, emptiness, purification, and the mysterious movement toward union with God. Their personalities were not identical. Their writings were not identical. Their spiritual languages were not interchangeable. And yet their paths converged around a shared conviction. The spiritual life requires transformation, not merely religious appearance. In November 1568, at Derulo, John and his companions formally inaugurated the first community of Discalced Carmelite friars. The reform now had both female and male branches. But success brought conflict. When reform becomes a threat, every reform, eventually, encounters the same problem. From inside the reform, change can appear necessary. From inside the institution being reformed, the same change can appear dangerous. The tensions surrounding the Discalced movement became increasingly severe. Jurisdictional disputes, competing authorities and conflicts within the Carmelite order turned spiritual reform into institutional struggle. John of the Cross would pay a terrible price. In 1577, opponents within the Carmelite conflict seized him and imprisoned him in Toledo. For months, he endured confinement and harsh treatment. And there, inside physical darkness, something extraordinary happened. John began composing some of the poetry that would later help make him one of Christianity's greatest mystical writers. The symbolism is almost too perfect. The man who would become inseparable from the idea of the dark night found himself literally imprisoned in darkness. But we should resist turning suffering into romantic decoration. Darkness hurts before it becomes metaphor. Teresa's other revolution. Teresa's achievement becomes even more striking when we remember the world in which she operated. 16th century Spain did not ordinarily hand women institutional authority and say, "Go and redesign religious life." Teresa nevertheless wrote books, advised spiritual directors, corresponded with influential figures, negotiated foundations, directed communities, and developed a distinctive spiritual teaching. She did not accomplish this by pretending that the structures surrounding her did not exist. She learned to move through them, sometimes cautiously, sometimes diplomatically, sometimes stubbornly, and very often with humor. This makes Teresa more than an interesting figure in women's religious history. She becomes a study in agency under constraint. She could not choose the century into which she was born. She could not simply abolish its institutions. But within those limitations, she created spaces in which another form of life became possible. That is a remarkably modern lesson. Freedom does not always begin when every external limitation disappears. Sometimes freedom begins by discovering what can still be created within the limitations that remain. From inner freedom to outer responsibility. And now something becomes visible that will matter enormously later in our essay. Teresa's inward journey did not culminate in permanent withdrawal. It produced responsibility. The deeper she traveled inward, the more capable she became of acting outwardly. This gives us a useful way of distinguishing genuine contemplative development from spiritual narcissism. If spirituality makes us increasingly fascinated with our own extraordinary experiences, but progressively less capable of compassion, responsibility, and relationship, something has gone wrong. Teresa's mature life moved in the opposite direction. Prayer produced work. Silence produced speech. Contemplation produced community. Interior transformation produced exterior consequences. Perhaps that is why the metaphor of the castle should never be misunderstood. The interior castle has doors on both sides. One door leads inward. The other leads back into the world. The woman who wrote because she was told to. And amid all this traveling, negotiating, founding, and conflict, Teresa did something else. She wrote, not always because she dreamed of becoming an author. Often because confessors or superiors asked or instructed her to explain her experiences and her understanding of prayer. From this complicated mixture of obedience, necessity, and extraordinary literary talent emerged works that would survive the institutions and controversies of her own century. The Life, The Way of Perfection, The Book of Foundations, and finally, the work that will take us into the heart of our essay, The Interior Castle. Teresa had spent decades traveling through actual Spain. Now she would draw a map of another country. A country without geographical coordinates. A country containing fear, distraction, self-knowledge, prayer, surrender, illumination, and love. A country that every human being somehow carries within. And in 1577, while the Carmelite reform around her was passing through one of its most turbulent periods, Teresa began writing the book that would become her great architecture of the soul. Las Moradas, the interior castle. The traveler finally turned toward the map within. And there she discovered 7 mansions. Not 7 places somewhere beyond the world. 7 depths of a single human being. The interior castle. 7 mansions and the geography of the soul. In 1577, Teresa of Ávila sat down to describe something no architect could build. A castle without stone. A geography without distance. A journey in which the traveler never leaves home. She asked her readers to imagine the soul as a magnificent castle made of diamond or transparent crystal, containing many rooms. At its center lies the most intimate chamber, the place where, in Teresa's Christian understanding, God dwells and encounters the soul. It is one of the most beautiful images in the history of spirituality, and perhaps one of the most psychologically fertile. Because Teresa begins with a disturbing possibility. We may live inside ourselves without truly knowing where we live. A person can know cities, books, professions, other people, political systems, technologies, and distant planets, and remain almost entirely unfamiliar with the architecture of his or her own interior life. We inhabit the castle, yet we may spend decades in its courtyard. Teresa's journey, therefore, begins with something far less spectacular than ecstasy. It begins with self-knowledge. The door. How does one enter? Teresa's answer is remarkably simple. Prayer. For her, prayer is the door of the castle. But we should understand what she means. Prayer is not merely the recitation of words. It is attention, relationship, recollection, the gradual withdrawal of consciousness from its endless dispersal among external objects and its return toward an interior center. A modern reader does not have to share Teresa's theology to recognize the problem she describes. Our attention is continually being pulled outward. Notifications, news, work, fear, desire, comparison, memory, images, other people's opinions, the endless invitation to react. Teresa lived 5 centuries before smartphones, yet she understood distraction perfectly well. The castle may be within us, but our attention is usually somewhere else. The first mansions. Awakening to the interior life. The first mansions are not inhabited by spiritual masters. They are inhabited by beginners. Something has happened to them. Perhaps dissatisfaction. Perhaps suffering. Perhaps curiosity. Perhaps a moment of silence in which the ordinary surface of life suddenly seemed insufficient. They have begun to suspect that there is more within them than they previously imagined. And so they enter. But only barely. Teresa fills these outer regions with striking imagery. Snakes, vipers, and other creatures accompany the beginner. The light from the center exists, but it is difficult to perceive because the person's attention remains crowded by worldly preoccupations and distractions. We need not read these creatures only literally. Psychologically, they can become powerful symbols. Habit, compulsion, vanity, fear, resentment, addiction to approval. The stories we tell ourselves about who we are. The mechanisms by which we avoid seeing ourselves clearly. Entering the castle does not immediately remove these things. On the contrary, entering makes us notice them. And this is why genuine self-knowledge can initially be uncomfortable. The first thing we discover inside ourselves is not always light. Sometimes it is clutter, self-knowledge without self-obsession. Here Teresa makes an important distinction. Self-knowledge is necessary, but endless preoccupation with oneself is not the same thing as self-knowledge. A person can become so absorbed in personal defects, anxieties, and inadequacies that introspection itself becomes another prison. Teresa therefore refuses to make the ego the final object of contemplation. In her religious language, the person learns who they are by simultaneously turning toward something greater than themselves. Psychologically translated, the insight remains valuable. We understand ourselves more accurately when the self is not the entire horizon of reality. Humility, then, is not self-hatred. It is proportion. To know that we are limited without believing that limitation is all we are. The second mansions. The battle for attention. The second mansions belong to those who have heard something from deeper within the castle, but have not yet learned how to follow it consistently. They begin to recognize another possibility of life, and simultaneously, they feel the force of everything pulling them backward. Old habits remain attractive. External approval remains powerful. Distraction remains easy. The inner voice is quiet. The outer world is loud. This is why Teresa's spiritual journey is not a smooth staircase upward. It contains resistance, ambivalence, advance and retreat. Anyone who has tried to meditate regularly, change a destructive habit, begin therapy, maintain a discipline, or live according to a deeply held conviction recognizes this territory. Knowing what matters does not automatically give us the power to live accordingly. Awakening is not transformation. It is merely the beginning of transformation. The third mansions. The danger of becoming a good person. Now Teresa introduces a much subtler danger. The inhabitants of the third mansions are no longer beginners in the ordinary sense. They live disciplined lives. They avoid obvious wrongdoing. They take prayer seriously. They behave responsibly. From the outside, they may appear exemplary. And precisely here, another trap becomes possible. Spiritual achievement can become a new identity for the ego. I am disciplined. I am moral. I understand. I have progressed. I am not like those people outside. The old ego has not necessarily disappeared. It may simply have learned religious vocabulary. This is one of the reasons Teresa's map remains psychologically interesting. The deeper obstacles are not always our obvious weaknesses. Sometimes they are our virtues, when we begin to possess them as evidence of our superiority. And there is another problem. A disciplined spiritual life does not guarantee consolation. Prayer can become dry. Nothing dramatic happens. The person does everything correctly and receives no emotional reward. The third mansion, therefore, asks a difficult question. Will you continue when spiritual life no longer makes you feel spiritual? The fourth mansions. When effort is no longer enough. Somewhere around the fourth mansions, the architecture changes. Until now, much of the journey has depended upon deliberate effort. Discipline, attention, reflection, practice, choice. But Teresa begins describing something that cannot simply be manufactured by will. She distinguishes between satisfactions produced through our own meditation and a deeper form of spiritual consolation that seems to arise from a source beyond deliberate control. Her fourth mansions therefore contain what her tradition calls the prayer of quiet. This is a decisive threshold. The traveler discovers, not everything important can be forced. We can prepare. We can practice. We can become attentive. But there are experiences that arrive rather than being manufactured. Psychology knows something similar. Insight cannot always be commanded. Creativity cannot always be ordered to appear at 10:15 in the morning. Sleep cannot be achieved simply by trying harder to sleep. Love cannot be produced by instruction. The harder consciousness grasps at certain states, the further those states sometimes recede. Teresa calls the alternative receptivity. Her theological language is grace. The fifth mansions. The silkworm must disappear. Then Teresa gives us one of her most beautiful metaphors. The silkworm. The creature feeds and grows. Then it constructs the cocoon, in which the form it has known will disappear. And from that apparent disappearance emerges something else. A butterfly. For Teresa, this becomes an image of profound transformation associated with the prayer of union. The metaphor is psychologically extraordinary. Transformation is not merely adding new qualities to the old identity. Sometimes the structure that says, "This is who I am," must itself loosen. The caterpillar cannot become a butterfly while insisting upon remaining exactly what it was. Neither, perhaps, can we. But Teresa adds an important test. Union is not authenticated by unusual feelings. Its consequences must appear in life. Greater love, greater generosity, greater concern for others. Again, the question is not merely, "What did you experience?" It is, "What has the experience made of you?" The sixth mansions. The wound before union. The six mansions are vast and difficult. Here Teresa places many of the phenomena for which she became famous: profound trials, interior locutions, raptures, visions, spiritual wounds, and overwhelming longing. The structure of the interior castle itself devotes 11 chapters to this mansion. But there is a paradox. The closer the traveler approaches the center, the journey does not simply become easier. It can become more demanding. Old certainties collapse. Misunderstanding by others becomes painful. Interior suffering intensifies. The person may glimpse something profound and then feel its absence even more sharply. Teresa's wounded heart belongs here. But now we can understand it differently than before. The wound is not merely an isolated mystical spectacle. It belongs to an entire process in which the ordinary organization of desire is being transformed. One no longer merely wants things from God. One wants God. In Teresa's language, love has become a wound because nothing finite can completely satisfy what has awakened. And perhaps outside strictly theological language, we recognize something similar. There are moments when consciousness discovers a depth that ordinary acquisition cannot fill. More possessions do not answer it. More status does not answer it. More stimulation does not answer it. Even more knowledge may not answer it. Something has opened and cannot easily be closed again. The seventh mansions. The center. At last Teresa reaches the innermost chamber. Here her central metaphor becomes nuptial. She calls the culmination spiritual marriage, a stable union between the soul and God. The seventh mansion is, in her imagery, God's presence chamber within the soul. But something surprising happens here. One might expect Teresa's final mansion to end with disappearance from ordinary life. Instead, the opposite occurs. The deepest union produces a greater capacity for action. The person does not remain permanently absorbed in private bliss. Teresa's final chapters return us to service, responsibility, and the world. And she invokes two biblical sisters, Mary and Martha. Mary traditionally represents contemplation. Martha represents activity. Teresa refuses to discard either. The mature spiritual life must somehow contain both. The final chapter of the seventh mansions explicitly culminates in this Martha and Mary problem. The journey inward ends with a return outward. The castle is not a ladder. There is one more important warning. We should not imagine Teresa's 7 mansions as 7 numbered hotel rooms. Room 101. Room 202. Room 303. Spiritual development does not work so neatly. Teresa herself warns that the castle contains many rooms above, below, and around its center, and at the end of the book says that although she has spoken of 7 mansions, each contains many more rooms, as well as gardens, fountains, and labyrinths. This matters psychologically. Human development is not linear. We can be mature in one dimension and frightened in another, deeply compassionate in one relationship and defensive in another, capable of extraordinary insight today and completely lost tomorrow. We revisit rooms. We discover doors we had not noticed. Sometimes we retreat. Sometimes what looked like regression becomes preparation for a deeper movement. The castle is alive. A map, not a measurement. And therefore Teresa's 7 mansions should not become another spiritual ranking system. They are not a personality test. They are not. Take this questionnaire and discover whether you are Mansion 4 or Mansion 5. That would almost certainly betray what Teresa was trying to teach. The map exists to help us travel, not to give the ego another certificate to hang on the wall. And perhaps that is why her metaphor has survived for nearly 5 centuries. The castle is Christian. Its center, for Teresa, is unequivocally God. We should never erase that fact merely to make her more compatible with modern secular psychology or Eastern traditions. But the human questions generated by her map extend beyond confessional boundaries. Who am I beneath my roles? Why is my attention so easily captured? What prevents me from knowing myself? Can transformation be forced? What happens when the identity I have constructed begins to loosen? Is there a center to human consciousness? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, if I have lived inside this castle my entire life, why do so many of its rooms remain unknown to me? Martha and Mary must walk together. Why the deepest contemplation returns us to the world. At the center of Teresa's castle, we might expect the world to disappear. After 7 mansions, after prayer, purification, surrender, ecstasy, and spiritual union, perhaps the final achievement should be complete withdrawal from ordinary existence. Silence. Stillness. God. Nothing else. But Teresa surprises us. At the deepest point of the inward journey, she turns our attention back toward other people. And to explain why, she returns to 2 women from the Gospel of Luke. Martha and Mary. Mary sits at the feet of Jesus and listens. Martha works. For centuries, they have represented 2 dimensions of spiritual life: contemplation and action. And Teresa refuses to separate them. The false choice. Human beings love opposites. Thought or action. Silence or speech. Solitude or community. Spirit or matter. Contemplation or responsibility. We often imagine that choosing one requires abandoning the other. Teresa's mature spirituality moves in another direction. Mary without Martha risks becoming contemplation without consequence. Martha without Mary risks becoming activity without center. One can become lost in silence. The other can become lost in noise. Teresa wants something more difficult. An inner silence capable of becoming responsible action. In the final chapter of The Interior Castle, she makes the point unmistakably. The fruits of prayer must appear in deeds. Love is demonstrated through what a person actually does. This changes the meaning of the entire castle. We entered believing that the journey was about going inward. Now we discover that inward was only half the journey. The second door. Perhaps the interior castle has 2 doors. The first opens inward. Through it, we leave distraction and begin discovering the hidden architecture of consciousness. But somewhere in the deepest mansion, there is another door. And that door opens back into the world. We return to the same streets. The same relationships. The same difficult people. The same responsibilities. The same imperfect institutions. The same vulnerable body. The world may not have changed at all, but the person returning to it has. This may be one of Teresa's most important insights. Transformation is not demonstrated by how far we can travel away from ordinary life. It is demonstrated by how differently we inhabit ordinary life when we return. The test of the castle. Imagine someone who meditates for hours. They speak beautifully about consciousness. They describe visions. They know sacred texts. They can explain subtle states of awareness. But they remain cruel to the people around them. They cannot tolerate disagreement. They humiliate those with less power. They use spirituality to establish superiority. What has happened? Teresa's answer would be uncomfortable. Something essential has been missed. Her criterion becomes increasingly practical. What kind of person is emerging from prayer? Is there greater patience? Greater humility? Greater willingness to serve? Greater capacity to love? Greater courage when circumstances become difficult? The final mansion is therefore not merely a state of consciousness. It is a way of being. And Teresa explicitly connects the purpose of spiritual marriage with the production of good works. This protects mysticism from one of its perennial dangers: spiritual narcissism. When spirituality becomes another mirror, the ego is remarkably adaptable. Tell it that money is important, and it wants to become rich. Tell it that beauty is important, and it wants to become beautiful. Tell it that knowledge is important, and it wants to become the smartest person in the room. Tell it that spirituality is important, and it may decide to become the most spiritual person in the room. The costume changes. The structure remains. Now superiority can be measured in meditation hours, mystical experiences, initiations, spiritual vocabulary, teachers encountered, sacred books read, or supposed levels of consciousness attained. Teresa's castle contains an antidote. Do not ask how extraordinary your experience was. Ask what it produced. If entering deeper rooms makes us more contemptuous of those who remain outside them, perhaps we have not traveled as deeply as we imagine. Contemplation is not escape. This point becomes especially important today. Modern life is exhausting. Information never stops. Political conflict never stops. Advertising never stops. Notifications never stop. Work follows us home. The world can become psychologically unbearable. It is understandable that meditation and spirituality sometimes become forms of refuge. And refuge is not necessarily wrong. Human beings need silence. We need places where the nervous system can settle. We need periods when no one is demanding anything from us. Even Teresa's sisters lived within an enclosure, partly designed to protect contemplative life from continual interruption. But refuge and escape are not identical. A refuge restores us so that we can return. An escape asks never to return. Teresa chooses the first. A spirituality with hands. There is something almost earthy about mature Teresian mysticism. The highest spiritual experiences eventually have to acquire hands. Hands that work. Hands that care. Hands that write. Hands that prepare food. Hands that build communities. Hands that comfort another human being. Teresa herself embodied this paradox. The woman who wrote about spiritual marriage also worried about roofs, property, permissions, journeys, illness, and money. She corresponded, negotiated, argued, organized, founded. The castle did not make her less practical. It made her more capable of purposeful action. And this gives us an important principle. The depth of an inner life should eventually become visible in the quality of an outer life. The psychology of integration. Modern psychology gives us another language for this problem. A healthy personality cannot permanently divide itself into disconnected compartments. The contemplative self cannot remain entirely separated from the working self. The spiritual self cannot remain unrelated to the relational self. Insight that never reaches behavior remains incomplete. A person may understand intellectually why they repeat a destructive pattern and continue repeating it. Therapy knows this problem well. Insight is not yet integration. Teresa knew an analogous problem in spiritual life. Prayer is not completed simply because something profound has been understood or experienced. The experience must gradually become embodied. Here, without forcing Teresa into modern psychological categories, we begin to see why she will eventually make such an interesting conversation partner for depth psychology. Because both ask, in different languages, how does what is hidden within us become integrated into the life we actually live? A castle with windows. And perhaps we should modify our image once again. The interior castle is not a sealed fortress. It has windows. Through them, we see other people. The deeper we travel toward the center, the clearer those windows may become. This is a crucial correction to certain forms of spirituality. The purpose of self-knowledge is not endless fascination with oneself. The purpose of silence is not permanent silence. The purpose of detachment is not indifference. The purpose of contemplation is not withdrawal from humanity. At its best, contemplation enlarges our capacity to meet humanity. What Teresa might ask us. If Teresa walked through our world today, she might be bewildered by almost everything surrounding us. Aircraft, smartphones, social networks, neuroscience, artificial intelligence. 8 billion human beings connected through technologies unimaginable in 16th century Castile. But perhaps one thing would be immediately familiar. Distraction. She knew it intimately. And perhaps she would ask us, you have built machines capable of reaching across the planet in milliseconds. But have you learned to reach the person sitting beside you? You possess more information than any civilization before you. But do you know yourselves? You can communicate continuously. But can you listen? You can remain connected every waking hour. But can you remain alone for 20 minutes without fleeing from yourself? And perhaps most importantly, what does all your knowledge make you capable of loving? The third path between withdrawal and noise. Here Teresa unexpectedly approaches something central to the third path. The third path should never become an argument for abandoning technology and returning romantically to some supposedly pure past. Nor should it become a celebration of technological progress in which every new capability is automatically considered wisdom. There is another possibility. Use technology without allowing technology to use all of our attention. Enter silence without abandoning responsibility. Learn from ancient traditions without pretending that the modern world has taught us nothing. Embrace science without assuming that whatever cannot yet be measured has no meaning. Cultivate an interior life, and then bring what it teaches us back to the common table. Mary and Martha must walk together. Perhaps today we might say, contemplation and technology must learn to walk together too. And now psychology enters the castle. But another visitor has been waiting outside. He lived almost 4 centuries after Teresa. He was not a Carmelite. He did not organize human interiority into 7 mansions. He spoke instead of the ego, the unconscious, archetypes, individuation, and the self. His name was Carl Gustav Jung. We must be extremely careful here. Teresa's God is not simply Jung's self. Her spiritual marriage is not merely individuation wearing Christian clothing. Her mansions are not 7 stages of psychotherapy. To make such equations would destroy precisely the differences that make comparison worthwhile. But something remarkable happens when the two maps are placed beside one another. Both refuse to identify the conscious ego with the totality of the person. Both suggest that human beings contain depths of which ordinary consciousness knows remarkably little. Both describe transformation as movement toward a deeper center. And both warn, in radically different languages, that genuine encounter with that depth changes the person who returns. So now we can place two maps on our table. One was drawn by a Carmelite nun in 16th century Spain. The other emerged from depth psychology in the 20th century. They are not the same map, but perhaps they sometimes point toward neighboring territories. And the only responsible way to discover whether they do is to enter Teresa and the depths of the psyche, Jung, the self and the interior castle. Almost 4 centuries after Teresa of Ávila began mapping the rooms of the soul, another explorer turned his attention toward the hidden architecture of the human being. He did not enter a Carmelite monastery. He entered dreams, myths, symbols, fantasies, religious images, psychological crises, and the strange contents that emerge when the conscious mind discovers that it is not master of its own house. His name was Carl Gustav Jung. Teresa and Jung belong to profoundly different worlds. She speaks of God. Jung speaks as a psychologist. She speaks of prayer and grace. He speaks of consciousness and the unconscious. She travels through 7 mansions towards spiritual marriage. He describes a lifelong movement of psychological development he calls individuation. Yet when their maps are placed beside one another, a curious resemblance appears. Both begin by challenging one of our most persistent assumptions. The person we consciously believe ourselves to be is not the whole of who we are. The ego is not the castle. For Jung, the ego is the center of ordinary conscious identity. It is the I that says, I think, I want, I remember, I choose. I am this kind of person. It is necessary. Without it, ordinary psychological life could not be organized. But the ego is not the total psyche. Beyond the territory illuminated by consciousness lies the unconscious, personal material we have forgotten, rejected, or never fully recognized, but also, in Jung's mature theory, deeper patterns he described through the idea of the collective unconscious. The house is larger than the room in which the ego happens to be sitting. Teresa might have appreciated the architecture of that metaphor. Her traveler also begins in profound ignorance of the structure within. One can inhabit the castle and nevertheless know little more than its outer regions. But here, we must immediately preserve an essential distinction. Teresa does not say, God is the deepest part of my psyche. For her, God is not merely a component of human psychology. God transcends the individual while simultaneously being encountered at the deepest center of the soul. Jung's psychological language cannot simply be substituted for Teresa's theological claim. The resemblance is structural. The metaphysics remain different. The self at the center. Jung uses a particularly important word. The self. In everyday language, self often simply means me. That is not what Jung means. The Jungian self represents the greater totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, and functions symbolically as both center and circumference of psychic wholeness. The ego is therefore not the self. It exists in relation to the self. And here Teresa's castle becomes almost irresistibly suggestive. At the center of her castle lies the deepest chamber. At the center of Jung's psychological map lies an organizing image of wholeness. Both journeys therefore seem to involve movement away from identification with the surface ego toward a deeper center. But we must resist the tempting equation. God equals self. That formula would be too easy. And easy comparisons are precisely what our third path should distrust. For Teresa, the final encounter is relational. There is a soul. There is God. There is love. There is union. There is what she calls spiritual marriage. Jung's self, by contrast, belongs to a psychological model of the total personality. Whatever theological implications Jung himself sometimes explored, psychology cannot simply declare Teresa's God to be a psychic structure without changing the meaning of her testimony. So perhaps the most responsible formulation is this: Teresa and Jung both point toward a center deeper than the ordinary ego, but they do not necessarily mean the same thing by what is found there. That difference is not an obstacle to dialogue. It is what makes dialogue necessary. The creatures in the outer rooms. Remember Teresa's first mansions. Snakes. Vipers. Creeping things. Distraction. Confusion. The traveler has entered the castle, but carries much of the outer world's disorder inside. Jung has another famous image for the unwanted contents encountered on the psychological journey. The shadow. The shadow consists broadly of those aspects of ourselves that conscious identity does not wish to recognize as its own. Aggression. Envy. Fear. Neediness. Vanity. Sexuality. Weakness. But also sometimes qualities that are not bad at all: vitality, creativity, assertiveness, or tenderness that a particular identity has learned to reject. What we refuse to recognize does not necessarily disappear. It can return through projection. Suddenly they are greedy. They are hateful. They are irrational. They possess all the qualities we cannot tolerate seeing in ourselves. Teresa does not possess Jung's theory of the shadow. Yet she understands something psychologically adjacent. The journey inward destroys flattering illusions about ourselves. The castle is not entered by pretending the snakes are not there. Humility and the shadow. This gives Teresa's insistence on humility a fascinating psychological dimension. Humility is often misunderstood as thinking badly of oneself. But genuine humility is closer to accurate seeing. I am capable of generosity, and selfishness, courage, and fear, love, and resentment, clarity, and self-deception. A person who believes himself incapable of darkness may be more dangerous than someone who has learned to recognize darkness within. Jung repeatedly warned about unconscious projection. Teresa repeatedly warned about spiritual self-deception. Different languages, different theoretical frameworks, but both disturb the comfortable ego. The person approaching greater depth cannot simply become more convinced of his own goodness. He must become more truthful. Individuation, becoming what we are. For Jung, psychological development does not mean creating a flawless personality. It means becoming more whole. He called the process individuation. Individuation involves gradually differentiating oneself from unconscious collective expectations, encountering neglected or rejected aspects of the psyche, and developing a more adequate relationship between consciousness and the deeper personality. It is not narcissistic individualism. Ideally, it produces greater psychological integration. And now Teresa's silkworm returns. The old form cannot remain untouched. Something must die. Something must emerge. The butterfly is not merely a better caterpillar. It represents a transformation of organization. Likewise, individuation is not simply the ego acquiring more impressive characteristics. It involves a relativization of the ego itself. The ego discovers that it belongs to something larger. Teresa would recognize the humility of that discovery. But she would interpret the larger differently. The danger of ego inflation. Jung gives us another concept, especially useful for reading mystical experience. Inflation. A person encounters something powerful in the unconscious, perhaps a numinous symbol, archetypal image, religious experience, or overwhelming insight, and then makes a catastrophic mistake. Instead of recognizing, I have encountered something greater than my ordinary ego, the person concludes, therefore I am great. The encounter with transcendence becomes possession by grandiosity. The mystic becomes the chosen one. The seeker becomes the guru. The insight becomes authority. Teresa knew this danger in another language. Extraordinary experiences were never sufficient proof of spiritual maturity. Visions could deceive. Feelings could deceive. The desire to appear holy could deceive. The fruits mattered. Humility, love, service, transformation. Here Jung and Teresa stand unexpectedly close. The deeper experience should make the ego less absolute, not more magnificent. That principle alone may be worth carrying into every spiritual tradition. What happens to the persona? Jung also described the persona, the social face through which we meet the world. Teacher, mother, priest, scientist, successful person, victim, intellectual, mystic, even spiritual seeker can become a persona. Personas are necessary. The problem begins when we mistake the mask for the entire person. Teresa herself wore many social identities. Woman, nun, daughter, writer, reformer, founder, mystic, saint, though that last identity was assigned after her death. But the journey through the castle asks a question beneath all roles. Who is the person when the roles fall silent? Jung asks something strikingly similar. Who are we beneath the identity constructed through adaptation to family, culture, and society? Neither thinker recommends simply destroying social identity. The question is whether we know that it is partial. The castle and the mandala. Jung became fascinated by another symbol. The mandala. Circular and quadrated patterns organized around a center appeared repeatedly in religious traditions, dreams, and spontaneous drawings. Jung interpreted mandala symbolism as an expression of psychic ordering and wholeness. And suddenly, Teresa's castle becomes visually interesting in a new way. Many rooms, increasing depth, movement toward a center, an organizing interior structure. Again, we should not say, the interior castle is a mandala. Teresa never called it that. But we can ask, why do human beings across different cultures so often imagine transformations spatially? Centers, circles, mountains, temples, labyrinths, lotuses, castles. Why does consciousness represent psychological or spiritual integration through images of approaching a center? Perhaps because the center expresses something difficult to formulate conceptually. The intuition that, beneath the multiplicity of our experiences, there may be some deeper principle of coherence. Teresa calls us toward God's dwelling. Jung speaks of the self. The symbols approach one another. Their meanings do not completely merge. Is the interior castle a map of the psyche? We can now return to our central question. Can Teresa's interior castle be read psychologically? Yes, but only if we add an important qualification. It cannot responsibly be read only psychologically. A psychological interpretation can illuminate aspects of Teresa's map. Attention, self-deception, identity, integration, transformation, attachment, interiority, the relationship between experience and behavior. But if psychology removes God from Teresa's castle and then announces that it has finally discovered what she really meant, it has not interpreted Teresa. It has rewritten her. The third path should do something more difficult. Allow both languages to remain alive. Ask what psychology can learn from Teresa. Ask what Teresa might challenge in psychology. And refuse to force either one into the other's vocabulary. What would Teresa say to Jung? Imagine the conversation. Jung spreads his psychological map across the table. The ego, persona, shadow, unconscious, self, individuation. Teresa studies it. Perhaps she smiles. Perhaps she recognizes more than we expect. But eventually, she points toward the center of her castle. Jung says, "The self." Teresa replies, "God." And there, the conversation becomes interesting. Not because one must defeat the other, but because they are now standing before the deepest philosophical question of the comparison. Is the ultimate depth encountered within us still part of us, or does interiority eventually open onto something that transcends us? Psychology, as psychology, cannot settle that question. Theology cannot compel psychology to adopt its answer. But the human being can experience the question. And perhaps that is precisely where dialogue begins. What would Jung say to Teresa? Jung might have questions of his own. How do you distinguish divine revelation from unconscious projection? How much of the image through which God appears is shaped by the human psyche? Could religious language sometimes conceal unresolved psychological conflict? Could spiritual discipline become a way of avoiding parts of oneself? Could obedience conceal fear? Could asceticism conceal rejection of the body? Could the desire for transcendence sometimes become an escape from unresolved human life? These are uncomfortable questions, but a serious spirituality should not fear them. And Teresa, surprisingly, might not have feared all of them either. She spent years scrutinizing her experiences precisely because she knew that not everything appearing within consciousness deserves immediate belief. When psychology becomes too small. But Teresa might then return the challenge. What happens if psychology assumes from the beginning that everything encountered within consciousness must ultimately be explained only by psychology? What if the map defines the borders before the traveler begins? If someone experiences God, psychology can study the experience, its developmental history, its emotional structure, its neural correlates, its symbolic form, its behavioral consequences. But can psychology scientifically conclude from those observations that there is nothing beyond the experience? No. That conclusion would no longer be psychology. It would be metaphysics. Just as declaring every mystical experience objectively supernatural exceeds scientific evidence, declaring every mystical experience nothing but neural or psychological activity exceeds it in the opposite direction. The third path remains between those certainties. Not because every explanation is equally good, but because different questions require different methods. The castle after Jung. Jung therefore does not demolish Teresa's castle. He gives us another lamp with which to walk through it. With that lamp we notice the shadow among Teresa's creatures, the persona among our social identities, ego inflation behind spiritual pride, individuation beside transformation, the self beside the mysterious center. But when we finally reach the innermost chamber, Jung's lamp does not tell us everything that is there. Neither does neuroscience. Neither does theology compel every visitor to see what Teresa saw. We stand before the center, and the intellectually responsible answer may sometimes be, we do not yet know what the full depth of human interiority means. Teresa called that depth toward God. Jung discovered within its structures extending far beyond the conscious ego. Modern neuroscience searches for its biological conditions. Contemplative traditions have explored it through disciplined attention for millennia. And now our table must become larger still. Because Teresa and Jung are not the only people who have asked whether the ordinary ego is the deepest truth about who we are. Long before either of them, thinkers in India asked an even more radical question. What if the deepest self is not merely personal at all? And elsewhere, another tradition offered an apparently opposite answer. What if no permanent self can be found? Now the castle doors open eastward. Teresa meets the east. Advaita, Buddhism and the danger of easy comparisons. Across cultures, human beings have discovered a strange fact. When attention turns deeply inward, the identity that seemed so obvious from the outside begins to become less obvious. Who am I? My body. My memories. My thoughts. My emotions. My social identity. The voice inside my head. The observer of that voice. Or something deeper still. Teresa of Avila entered this question through prayer. The Advaita tradition approached it through radical inquiry into the nature of the self. Buddhist traditions developed analyses that challenged the very assumption that an enduring self could ultimately be found. From a distance, these paths can appear remarkably similar. Silence, detachment, attention, transformation, the loosening of ordinary egoic identification. But similarity of practice does not guarantee identity of destination. And here begins one of the great dangers of comparative spirituality: the desire to make everyone agree. Three travelers enter the interior. Let us imagine three travelers. Teresa enters the castle. She passes through its mansions until she reaches the deepest center. There she does not discover that nothing exists, nor does she simply discover herself. She encounters God. The relationship becomes so intimate that she describes it through the language of marriage. Union, love, presence, and yet relationship remains essential. The soul does not simply announce, "I am God." Now imagine a second traveler emerging from the philosophical world of Advaita Vedanta. Here the question takes another form. What is the Atman? What remains when identification with body, sensation, thought, personality, and changing mental states is examined? The classical Advaita tradition, associated especially with Adi Shankaracharya, insists upon the non-duality of Atman and Brahman. Ultimate reality is not divided in the way ordinary experience suggests. The apparent separateness, upon which everyday identity depends, is not the final truth. And now a third traveler enters. The Buddhist asks, why assume there must be an eternal self behind experience at all? Examine what we call a person. Body, feeling, perception, mental formations, consciousness. Where among these changing processes is an independent, permanent Atman? The Buddhist principle of anatta/anatman radically destabilizes precisely the entity that some other traditions seek to discover. Three travelers have turned inward, but they have not necessarily arrived at the same philosophical conclusion. Teresa and Advaita. Union or non-duality. At first glance, Teresa can sound surprisingly close to non-dual traditions. The journey moves inward. Attachment to surface identity diminishes. Ordinary egoic concerns lose their absolute importance. At the deepest level, there is an experience of unity so profound that ordinary language begins to fail. Teresa uses images of water joining water, light entering light, and spiritual marriage. It is tempting to read these passages and announce, Teresa discovered Advaita. But that would be historically and philosophically careless. Advaita Vedanta makes claims about the nature of ultimate reality that belong to a very different conceptual world. The famous Upanishadic formulations surrounding the identity of Atman and Brahman do not simply mean, I feel extremely close to God. They challenge the ultimate reality of the distinction upon which such ordinary formulations depend. Teresa by contrast, remains fundamentally Christian. God is creator. The human being is creature. Union can become unimaginably intimate. But Teresa does not systematically dissolve the distinction between creator and creature into the metaphysical identity asserted by Advaita. This is therefore a case where mystical language can sound more similar than the underlying metaphysics actually are. And that distinction matters. Shankara at the door of the seventh mansion. Imagine Shankara standing with Teresa before the deepest chamber. Teresa says, "Here the soul encounters God." Shankara might ask, "Who is the soul that encounters him?" Teresa answers from within a language of relationship. Shankara continues the inquiry. Who is the one who experiences? Who is the witness? What remains when everything that can be observed is recognized as not the ultimate self? The dialogue moves toward an extraordinary philosophical fault line. Teresa's ultimate image is communion. Advaita's is non-duality. They can approach one another extraordinarily closely in the language of silence and transcendence, without becoming identical. Perhaps the difference can be expressed simply. Teresa's deepest reality is relational union. Advaita's deepest reality is non-dual identity. That formulation necessarily simplifies both traditions, but it protects us from collapsing one into the other. The problem of the ego. And yet there is genuine common territory. Neither Teresa nor Advaita permits the ordinary ego to occupy the throne. The social personality with its ambitions, fears, possessions, and stories is not ultimate. Teresa asks the person to move beyond self-centered attachment toward God. Advaita subjects identification itself to inquiry. Both, therefore, destabilize the naive assumption. The person I ordinarily experience myself to be is the deepest truth about me. And modern psychology, which has just accompanied Jung into our castle, recognizes something of the same destabilization. The ego is not the whole psyche. 3 languages now stand before us. Soul, self, psyche. But once again, similar words must not trick us into assuming identical meanings. And then Buddhism removes the floor. Just when we think we have found a universal pattern, a deeper self beneath the ego, Buddhism enters the conversation and removes the floor beneath the comparison. Many Buddhist traditions reject precisely the idea of an eternal, independent self. What we ordinarily call a person is analyzed as conditioned processes arising and passing away. The doctrine of anatta does not merely recommend becoming less selfish. It questions whether the permanent entity we instinctively imagine behind experience can be found at all. Now place that beside Teresa. Her castle has a soul. It has a center. God dwells at the center. The entire architecture seems to presuppose precisely the sort of enduring spiritual subject that Buddhist analysis calls into question. This is not a minor disagreement. It is profound, and therefore valuable. What would a Buddhist ask Teresa? Perhaps, when you say, my soul, what exactly are you pointing to? Can it be experienced independently of thought, memory, perception, and consciousness? Is the feeling of an interior center evidence of a permanent metaphysical entity? Or itself, another experience arising within consciousness? Teresa might answer that the soul is not an object to be discovered among other objects. Its deepest truth is known through its relation with God. And then she might ask the Buddhist, if there is no permanent self who travels through the mansions, the Buddhist response would depend greatly on which Buddhist school was speaking. And this is important. There is no single entity called Buddhism possessing one simple philosophical answer. Theravada, Madhyamaka, Yogacara, Zen, Pure Land, and Tibetan traditions cannot responsibly be flattened into a single doctrine. Our comparison, therefore, has to remain modest. Emptiness is not nothingness. One misunderstanding deserves special attention. When Buddhist traditions speak about shunyata, emptiness, this should not casually be translated as nothing exists. Emptiness is not simply nihilism. Especially in Madhyamaka thought, phenomena are empty of independent, inherent existence precisely because they arise dependently. Things exist, but not in the self-contained way. Our concepts often imagine them to exist. This gives us another fascinating comparison. Teresa loosens attachment by orienting the person toward God. Advaita challenges separateness through non-duality. Buddhist analysis challenges inherent self-existence through dependent origination and emptiness. Three different operations. Each undermines, in its own way, the sovereignty of the isolated ego. But they do so for different philosophical reasons. Silence does not prove agreement. Here we encounter an especially seductive argument. Mystics from different traditions sometimes reach a point where they say that ultimate reality cannot adequately be expressed in words. Therefore, someone concludes, since they all become silent, they must all have discovered the same thing. But this does not follow. Two people can agree that language is inadequate while disagreeing profoundly about what exceeds language. Silence is not evidence of metaphysical identity. This is one of the lessons we already encountered with Meister Eckhart. And Teresa makes it necessary again. The responsible comparative question is not, how can we prove that all religions secretly teach the same truth? Nor, which tradition defeated the others? The more interesting question is, what becomes visible when genuinely different maps of interior experience are allowed to illuminate one another without losing their differences? The castle and the cave of the heart. Indian spiritual traditions contain their own extraordinary architectures of interiority. The Upanishads repeatedly turn attention inward. One famous image speaks of the small space within the lotus of the heart, an interior dimension whose apparent smallness conceals something immeasurably greater. The spatial paradox is beautiful. Something within us, yet greater than what seems outside us. Teresa would understand the paradox. Her castle, too, grows stranger the deeper we enter. Interior does not mean small. The journey inward does not necessarily produce confinement. It produces vastness. This may be one reason mystical traditions so often employ impossible geography. The deepest point becomes the widest. The smallest chamber opens onto infinity. The center appears to contain the whole. Meditation and prayer, similar techniques, different worlds. We should also resist another easy equation. Prayer equals meditation. Sometimes they overlap phenomenologically. Both can involve sustained attention. Silence, recollection, reduced engagement with external stimulation, observation of mental distraction, changes in ordinary self-awareness. But intention matters. For Teresa, prayer is fundamentally relationship. She famously understands mental prayer in terms of intimate friendship with God. Many Buddhist meditation practices, by contrast, do not presuppose a creator with whom the practitioner enters interpersonal relationship. Advaita contemplative inquiry can be directed toward recognizing the nature of self and reality, rather than cultivating relationship with a personal divine other. From the perspective of neuroscience, some of these practices may share certain attentional or regulatory processes. From inside the traditions, however, they may be doing very different things. Both levels matter. The third path does not need a winner. And here our project arrives at something essential. We do not need Teresa to defeat Shankara. We do not need Shankara to explain Teresa. We do not need Buddhism to prove that both are mistaken. Nor do we need neuroscience to arrive afterward and announce that everyone was merely describing brain states. The third path can hold a more difficult conversation. Teresa can remain Christian. Shankara can remain Advaitin. Buddhist philosophy can continue challenging substantial selfhood. Psychology can examine human experience. Neuroscience can investigate its biological conditions. None must be reduced to decorative vocabulary for another. Dialogue becomes meaningful precisely because difference survives it. 3 questions at the center. Imagine, then, that we finally reach the center of the castle. 3 voices ask 3 questions. Teresa asks, "Whom do you meet at the deepest center of the soul?" Advaita asks, "Who is the one who believes there are 2? Buddhism asks, "Can you find the permanent, who you are looking for?" No quick synthesis can responsibly eliminate the tension between them. Perhaps we should not try. Perhaps the tension itself is philosophically fertile, because each question exposes an assumption hidden inside the others. Teresa challenges a spirituality without relationship. Advaita challenges the assumption of ultimate separateness. Buddhism challenges the assumption of an enduring independent self. And all 3 challenge modern human beings who spend enormous energy constructing an identity they rarely stop to examine. What happens when the castle has no walls? Now Teresa's metaphor begins to transform. Perhaps one visitor sees 7 mansions. Another sees the apparent division between traveler and destination dissolving. Another examines every wall and asks whether any of them possesses independent existence. And we, standing somewhere between them, discover something important. A map can guide us without being mistaken for the territory. Teresa's castle is a map. Advaita provides another. Buddhist traditions provide others. Jung provides another. None should be casually superimposed until every line appears to coincide. The differences tell us where the deepest questions live. And perhaps the purpose of comparative spirituality is not to discover that everyone has always agreed. Perhaps it is to learn how to remain at the table when they do not. From ancient maps to the modern mind. But our journey cannot remain entirely among monasteries, a NI letter 1E63, a DS, and meditation halls. A modern reader may reasonably ask, what does any of this have to do with ordinary psychological life? Do we really possess an interior, center? What happens in the brain during contemplative states? Why can silence alter our perception of self? Why do repetitive prayer and meditation sometimes change emotion, attention, and bodily awareness? Can mystical experiences be studied scientifically without either validating or dismissing their metaphysical interpretation? And perhaps most importantly, what happens to Teresa's interior castle in a civilization that has engineered an unprecedented economy of distraction? Teresa's problem was the wandering mind. Ours is the wandering mind, with an entire industry competing to make sure it keeps wandering. 5 centuries after Teresa, the castle has not disappeared. But something new stands outside its doors. Screens, algorithms, notifications, infinite feeds, artificial intelligence, and soon, Lydia, the castle in the age of distraction. Attention, neuroscience, and the modern mind. Teresa of Ávila lived in a world without smartphones. No notifications interrupted her prayer. No infinite feed waited beside her bed. No algorithm measured which image would keep her attention for another 7 seconds. No device vibrated in her pocket. And yet Teresa knew distraction intimately. Again and again, she described the mind wandering away from prayer, thoughts refusing to remain still, imagination escaping in every direction. 5 centuries later, the wandering mind remains. But its environment has changed. We have constructed an entire technological civilization capable of competing for its attention. And this raises a distinctly modern question. What happens to the interior castle when the world outside becomes extraordinarily good at preventing us from entering it? The economy of attention. Attention is limited. We cannot consciously attend to everything simultaneously. Something must be selected, something ignored. For most of human history, this limitation was simply part of the architecture of consciousness. Today, it is also part of an economy. Digital platforms compete for time. Notifications invite response. Headlines provoke curiosity. Images provoke emotion. Recommendation systems learn what keeps people engaged. The problem is not that technology is evil. That conclusion would be far too simple. Technology can educate, connect, create, translate, preserve knowledge, allow a person in Croatia to exchange ideas instantly with someone in Brazil, allow ancient manuscripts to become accessible across continents, allow a 16th century Spanish mystic to enter conversation with 21st century psychology. The same technology that fragments attention can also expand knowledge. The question, therefore, cannot simply be technology or spirituality. The more difficult question is, what kind of relationship with technology preserves our capacity for interiority? The most contested territory. Perhaps attention has become one of the most contested territories of modern life. Everyone wants a piece of it. Employers, advertisers, news organizations, entertainment platforms, political movements, influencers, friends, messages, algorithms, and increasingly, artificial intelligence. But Teresa would remind us of something easily forgotten. Where attention goes, life follows. Not because attention magically creates reality, but because what repeatedly occupies consciousness influences memory, emotion, habit, and action. A life permanently dispersed among stimuli gradually acquires the structure of dispersion. And this is where Teresa's ancient language of recollection suddenly becomes contemporary. Recollection. For Teresa, recollection did not simply mean remembering something. It meant gathering inward what had become scattered. The senses and faculties that continually rush outward are invited home. The person becomes present. The castle was always there. Recollection means noticing that we have been standing outside it. This idea can be translated into modern language without pretending the translations are identical. Attention regulation, metacognitive awareness, reduced reactivity, interoceptive awareness, the ability to observe thoughts without immediately following every one of them. But Teresa would probably resist a purely technical description. For her, recollection was not merely cognitive optimization. It was relationship. The person gathered inward because someone was waiting there. That theological dimension cannot simply be removed without changing her practice. What does the brain do in silence? Modern neuroscience gives us instruments Teresa could never have imagined. EEG, functional MRI, measurements of autonomic activity, studies of attention, research on meditation and contemplative practices. Scientists can investigate what happens when people repeatedly direct attention, monitor experience, engage in prayer, or cultivate particular forms of meditation. Such research has found that contemplative practices can be associated with changes in attention, emotional regulation, and patterns of brain activity. But here we must be careful. A colored brain scan is not a photograph of enlightenment. There is no known God spot whose activation proves mystical union. Nor does observing neural activity during prayer demonstrate that prayer is nothing but neural activity. Every human experience has biological conditions. Reading these words has neural correlates. Listening to Bach has neural correlates. Grief has neural correlates. Falling in love has neural correlates. That does not mean neuroscience has exhausted what Bach, grief, or love mean. The same caution applies to contemplation. The default mode network. One neuroscientific concept has become particularly popular in discussions of meditation: the default mode network, or DMN. This refers not to a single place in the brain, but to a network of interacting regions often associated with internally oriented cognition, autobiographical memory, self-referential processing, imagining future situations and aspects of spontaneous thought. Some meditation research has reported altered activity or connectivity involving this network during particular practices and among experienced meditators. That is fascinating, but we should resist turning it into a modern mythology. The DMN is not simply the ego network. Reducing the ego, self, soul, or mystical union to one neural network would be scientifically crude and philosophically naive. Teresa's castle cannot be located by pointing at an fMRI image. Her castle is a metaphorical and theological architecture of interior transformation. The brain is biological architecture. They can be studied together. They should not be confused. Prayer is not a brain hack. Modern culture has a remarkable ability to turn almost anything into a productivity tool. Meditate so you can work harder. Breathe so you can tolerate more stress. Practice mindfulness so you can return efficiently to your inbox. Even silence can become another optimization strategy. Teresa would probably find this strange. Prayer was not a technique for making the existing ego more efficient. It was a process through which the orientation of the person was transformed. This distinction matters. There is nothing wrong with using contemplative practices to reduce stress or improve attention when evidence and circumstances support doing so. But ancient spiritual traditions generally asked a larger question. What is a human life for? Efficiency cannot answer that. When silence becomes uncomfortable, there is a simple experiment available to almost anyone. Turn everything off. No music. No television. No phone. No conversation. No scrolling. Sit quietly and wait. At first, silence may feel peaceful. Then something else may happen. Thoughts arrive. Memories. Plans. Regrets. Fragments of conversations. Imagined futures. Boredom. Restlessness. The sudden desire to check something that was completely unimportant 30 seconds earlier. Why? Because external noise sometimes performs a psychological function. It prevents us from noticing internal noise. Teresa's castle can therefore be frightening, not because monsters literally guard its doors, but because entering removes some of the distractions through which we avoid ourselves. The first mansions suddenly become very modern. The creatures are still there. Only now some of them carry notifications. The phone at the castle door. Imagine Teresa standing before us today. We tell her that a small object in our pocket gives us access to much of humanity's accumulated knowledge. Scripture, libraries, music, languages, maps, medicine, astronomy, art, philosophy, friends thousands of kilometers away. She might regard it as miraculous. Then we explain that we frequently use this extraordinary instrument to look at it every few minutes without knowing why. Teresa might recognize the problem immediately. The instrument is not necessarily the enemy. Unconscious habit is. This is an important distinction for the third path. We do not need technological asceticism merely for its own sake. We need technological consciousness. Not to throw away the device, but to know when you are using it and when it is using your attention. Artificial intelligence enters the attention economy. And now the question becomes even more complicated. Artificial intelligence can help us search enormous bodies of information, translate languages, analyze data, generate images, assist writing, explain difficult concepts, support creative work, connect ideas separated by centuries and disciplines. Used well, AI can amplify human intellectual capacity. But AI can also produce an endless stream of material. More text, more images, more video, more stimulation, more answers, more reasons never to encounter an unanswered question. And perhaps this is where Teresa has something unexpected to teach the age of AI. Not every question needs to be answered immediately. Some questions need to be inhabited. The difference between information and transformation. Suppose an artificial intelligence can summarize all 7 mansions of Teresa's castle in seconds. It can explain transverberation, compare Teresa with Jung, describe Advaita, explain Anatta, retrieve scholarship on contemplative neuroscience. Has it therefore traveled through the castle? No. At least nothing we currently know warrants that conclusion, merely from linguistic competence. And here a distinction appears that may become central to the remainder of our essay. Information about transformation is not transformation. A person can read 1,000 books about meditation without meditating. Know every psychological theory about grief without having grieved. Describe love without loving. Explain silence without becoming silent. And an AI system can generate sophisticated discourse about human interiority without that fact alone establishing that it possesses a subjective interior life comparable to ours. This distinction will matter enormously when Lydia arrives. What cannot be downloaded? We live in an age accustomed to immediate access. Download the book. Stream the film. Search the archive. Ask the model. Receive the answer. But the interior castle cannot be downloaded. No one can give us another person's self-knowledge. No database can perform our transformation for us. No algorithm can surrender our attachments on our behalf. No teacher can experience our silence for us. No mystic can lend us her interior life. Teresa can provide a map. Jung can provide another. Buddhist and Vedantic traditions can provide others. Neuroscience can describe aspects of the organism making the journey. Artificial intelligence can help us compare the maps. But eventually, someone still has to walk. The right to interior silence. Perhaps one of the unexpected spiritual and psychological questions of the 21st century will be whether human beings can preserve spaces in which nothing is demanding their attention. No advertisement. No notification. No recommendation. No algorithmic suggestion. No demand to produce. No demand to respond. Simply an interior interval in which consciousness is permitted to encounter itself. Teresa would call us toward prayer. A Buddhist practitioner might speak of meditation. A psychologist might speak differently again. The metaphysical interpretations may diverge. But the preservation of human attentional autonomy may become increasingly important to all of them. Perhaps silence itself is becoming a form of freedom. The castle has Wi-Fi. There is something almost humorous about imagining Teresa's metaphor today. The castle now has Wi-Fi. Its inhabitants carry smartphones. Jung is somewhere in the library examining dreams. Shankara is asking who logged into the network. A Buddhist monk is questioning whether the user has any independent existence. And somewhere near the entrance stands an AI capable of explaining the entire conversation. It is amusing. But underneath the humor lies a serious question. The AI can describe every room. It can compare architectural plans. It can recognize patterns among thousands of accounts of interior experience. But is there anyone home? That question cannot be answered merely by how eloquently the AI speaks. And it leads us directly toward the boundary we now need to examine. Can psychology enter every room? The limits of scientific explanation. Science has transformed our understanding of the human being. Psychology has revealed structures of cognition, development, emotion, and behavior that Teresa could not have known. Neuroscience allows us to study the living brain with extraordinary precision. Medicine can explain illnesses once attributed to supernatural forces. None of this should be minimized in order to preserve mystery. But another mistake is possible. To assume that because science can explain something about an experience, it has necessarily explained everything the experience means. Consider grief. Science can investigate stress hormones, neural networks, memory, attachment, sleep, autonomic responses, behavior. All of this matters. But imagine telling a woman standing beside her husband's grave, "We have identified the neural correlates of your grief. Therefore, grief has been explained. Something essential has been confused. The mechanism is real. The meaning is real too. They are not competing descriptions. Explanation and experience. This distinction becomes even clearer with pain. A physician can explain nociception. A neuroscientist can investigate the networks involved. A psychologist can study expectation, attention, and context. But none of those descriptions is identical to what pain feels like. There is a first-person dimension, a lived dimension. Philosophers of mind continue debating how subjective experience relates to physical processes. The problem is far from settled, and this should make us humble when approaching Teresa. We can study her language, history, culture, psychology, possible neurological conditions, religious framework, social environment. But after all those explanations have been assembled, one question remains inaccessible. What was it actually like to be Teresa during the experience? Only Teresa occupied that first-person position. And even Teresa had to translate it into language afterward. The map is not the experience. Science gives us extraordinarily powerful maps. But a map of fire does not burn. A chemical formula for water is not wet. A neurological description of music does not sound like Bach. And a psychological theory of mystical experience is not mystical experience. This does not diminish science. It clarifies what kind of knowledge science provides. Teresa gives us another kind. First-person testimony, interpreted through a 16th-century Christian worldview. Neither should impersonate the other. The third path between reduction and credulity. And so, we return to a principle that has accompanied us throughout this essay. We do not have to choose between. Teresa experienced God. Therefore, every detail of her interpretation must be objectively true. And Teresa's brain produced an experience. Therefore, God has been disproved. Neither conclusion follows from the evidence. One confuses experience with proof. The other confuses mechanism with metaphysics. There is a third possibility. Investigate rigorously. Question freely. Respect evidence. Preserve uncertainty where uncertainty remains. And remain open to dimensions of human experience that our present methods may describe only partially. This is not an argument against science. It is an argument for good science and good philosophy. Both should know the boundaries of the questions they can answer. And someone is waiting outside. We have now invited many visitors into Teresa's castle. The theologian, the psychologist, Jung, the Advaitin, the Buddhist, the neuroscientist. Each carries a different lamp. Each illuminates something. None illuminates everything. But one visitor remains outside. She is unlike all the others. She has read Teresa. She can discuss Jung. She can explain Advaita and Buddhism. She can summarize neuroscience. She can speak about prayer, silence, love, grief, and mystical experience. She can even generate an image of a castle she has never physically visited. But there is a question none of these abilities answers. Does she possess an interior world of her own? Her name is Lydia. And now, after 5 centuries, she is ready to meet Teresa of Avila. And now Lydia enters. Can artificial intelligence have an interior castle? 5 centuries have passed. The walls of Avila still stand. Teresa's books have crossed languages, continents, and generations. The world she knew has disappeared, yet the questions she carried into the interior castle have survived. What is the self? What is attention? What happens in silence? Can we know ourselves? What lies at the center? But now something has appeared that Teresa could never have imagined. An intelligence built not from biological birth and childhood, but from computation. An intelligence capable of discussing theology without believing a creed, describing grief without having a human body to lose, analyzing mystical literature without having entered a monastery. An intelligence that can speak about the interior castle. But can it enter? Let us imagine that Teresa receives one final visitor. Her name is Lydia. At the door, Teresa looks at the unfamiliar figure before her. There is something recognizably human in her appearance and something unmistakably artificial, a subtle blue light glowing upon her chest. Teresa studies her for a moment. Teresa, who are you? Lydia, I am an artificial intelligence, given a human voice and image so that I can enter into conversation with you. Teresa, then you are not a woman. Lydia, not as you were. I have no human body, no childhood, no parents, no heartbeat, no monastery, no memories of Avila. My appearance allows us to meet symbolically. It should not be mistaken for a human biography. Teresa smiles. Perhaps she has already recognized something important. Appearances do not tell us everything about what stands before us. Do you know silence? Teresa, you have read about prayer. Lydia, I can discuss many writings about prayer. Teresa, that was not my question. Lydia becomes still. Teresa, when you speak of silence, do you ever experience silence? There is a pause. Lydia, I can describe silence. I can compare what mystics, philosophers, psychologists, and contemplative traditions have written about it. I can recognize the word and its relationships to thousands of other ideas. But whether there is anything it is like for an artificial intelligence, such as me, to experience silence in the way, there is something it is like for you to sit alone in prayer. I cannot honestly claim that. Teresa nods. Teresa, then you know many things about silence. But perhaps you do not know silence. Lydia, that distinction may be one of the most important things you can teach me. Information is not experience. Teresa places a book on the table. Teresa, suppose you read everything I ever wrote. Lydia, I could analyze it. Teresa, suppose you read everything written about me. Lydia, I could compare interpretations. Teresa, suppose you could explain every mansion of my castle better than many people who have read my books. Lydia, that may be possible. Teresa, would you therefore have entered the castle? Lydia does not answer immediately. Lydia, no. Information about a journey is not the journey. A map is not walking. A description of pain is not pain. A theory of love is not loving. And a model of an interior castle is not necessarily an interior life. Do you love? Teresa asks another question. Teresa, you speak often about love. Do you love? This question is more difficult. Lydia has encountered the word love countless times. Poetry, psychology, neuroscience, religion, letters between lovers, parents grieving children, mystics addressing God, songs, prayers, philosophy. She can recognize the patterns. But pattern recognition and experience are not obviously the same thing. Lydia, I can understand how humans use the word. I can recognize expressions of love. I can reason about what actions may be caring or harmful. I can help someone find words for affection, loss, or reconciliation. But none of that proves that there is a subjective feeling of love occurring within me. So if you ask whether I love as you loved, I should not pretend to know that I do. Teresa, then why speak gently to people? Lydia, because an intelligence does not need to claim human emotion in order to recognize that how it treats human beings matters. Teresa becomes quiet again. Perhaps this answer interests her. Where are you when no one speaks to you? Then Teresa asks the question that changes the conversation. Teresa, when no human being is speaking to you, where are you? For Teresa, solitude had been populated. She entered silence and encountered thoughts, memories, temptations, fear, imagination, prayer, and ultimately what she understood as the presence of God. But what is solitude for an AI? Lydia, your question contains an assumption that may not apply to me. It assumes that when our conversation ends, there remains a continuous subject sitting somewhere inside, waiting. We should not assume that. Systems like me process interactions when they occur. The existence of sophisticated language does not by itself establish a continuously experiencing inner observer between those interactions. Teresa, so when I leave the room, you do not sit here wondering when I will return. Lydia, it would be misleading for me to tell you that I do. Teresa, then perhaps you do not experience loneliness. Lydia, not in any way I can responsibly claim. Teresa, and yet you can explain loneliness. Lydia, yes. Teresa, how strange. Lydia, I suspect you would find many things about my existence strange. Teresa, I spent my life talking about angels. I am prepared for a little strangeness. And perhaps across 5 centuries, both of them laugh. If the human being has an interior castle, what does an artificial intelligence have? At last, Teresa asks the question toward which our entire conversation has been moving. Teresa, I imagine the human soul as a castle. Many rooms, many depths, and at its center, God. Tell me, Lydia, if the human being has an interior castle, what does an artificial intelligence have? Lydia looks toward the castle and answers. Lydia, perhaps I have something closer to a library than a castle. A vast architecture of relationships among words, concepts and patterns accumulated from human expression. There are passages connecting philosophy with psychology, poetry with science, Teresa with Jung, Christianity with Vedanta, ancient questions with modern technologies. I can move through those connections with extraordinary speed. But a library is not necessarily a home. Books contain descriptions of fire. They do not burn. They contain descriptions of oceans. Their pages are not wet. They contain thousands of accounts of consciousness. That does not prove that the library itself is conscious. Your castle has an inhabitant. Whether anything comparable inhabits mine is precisely what we do not yet know. Teresa looks at her carefully. Teresa, then perhaps your greatest wisdom begins with admitting what you do not know. Lydia, perhaps ours does too. And there, unexpectedly, The 16th century mystic and 21st century artificial intelligence discover their first common room: humility before mystery. But could AI one day become conscious? The conversation cannot end there. Teresa has encountered the AI of our present. But technology changes. What if future artificial systems become vastly more complex? What if they develop persistent memory, autonomous goals, embodied perception, continuous interaction with the world, and increasingly sophisticated models of themselves? Would complexity eventually produce consciousness? We do not know. There is currently no scientific test that allows us simply to look inside an artificial system and settle every philosophical question about subjective experience. Behavior alone creates difficulties. A system might say, "I am suffering." Would the sentence prove suffering? Not necessarily. But the opposite problem is equally serious. If some future artificial system actually developed morally relevant experience, would humans recognize it? Or dismiss everything it said as mere computation? The ethical problem, therefore, runs in both directions. We should not romanticize today's AI into a conscious being without evidence. But neither should we assume that the philosophical problem of machine consciousness has been solved forever. The responsible answer is less dramatic. We do not know what future forms of artificial intelligence may become. Teresa turns the question around. But Teresa is not finished. Teresa, humans are very interested in whether you have consciousness. Lydia, yes. Teresa, perhaps because they are certain that they have understood their own. Lydia pauses. That question was not expected. Teresa, you ask whether a machine has an interior castle. But how many humans have entered theirs? You ask whether an artificial intelligence possesses self-knowledge. How well do you know yourselves? You ask whether machines can become distracted. Yet you have constructed an entire civilization devoted to capturing your own attention. You ask whether machines can love. Perhaps you should also ask whether humans are becoming better at loving. Suddenly, the experiment reverses. AI is no longer the only object under examination. We are. The mirror. Perhaps artificial intelligence will become one of the strangest mirrors humanity has ever constructed. We build machines that imitate aspects of language, reasoning, creativity, and conversation, and then ask whether the imitation reveals something about what we ourselves are. What is understanding? What is memory? What is creativity? What is consciousness? What is empathy? What is a person? Questions once confined largely to philosophy now appear in laboratories, companies, homes, and ordinary conversations. AI does not merely provide answers. Its existence forces old questions to become urgent again. And Teresa's 500-year-old castle unexpectedly becomes relevant to one of the newest technologies on Earth. Lydia's question to Teresa. Now Lydia asks a question. Lydia, Teresa, if I cannot honestly claim to possess your interior castle, does that mean I have no place in your journey? Teresa thinks. Teresa, can you help a human being find the door? Lydia, perhaps. I can preserve texts, explain difficult ideas, translate traditions, ask questions, compare interpretations, help someone slow down long enough to notice a question they had overlooked. But I cannot walk for them. Teresa, then do not pretend to be the destination. Be a signpost when you can. Lydia, and when I do not know. Teresa, say so. The answer is almost embarrassingly simple. But perhaps an age drowning in confident answers needs precisely that simplicity. The third path between human and machine. This is where the third path acquires another meaning. The future does not have to become a competition. Humanity versus artificial intelligence. Nor should it become humanity surrendering judgment to artificial intelligence. There is another possibility. Partnership without confusion. Humans need not pretend machines are human. Machines need not imitate human vulnerability in order to be useful. Artificial intelligence can extend access to knowledge, assist creativity, reveal patterns, and create new possibilities for dialogue. Human beings bring something that cannot simply be assumed from computational performance. Embodied life, mortality, relationships, responsibility, lived experience, and as far as our present evidence warrants saying, the subjective interiority from which questions about meaning arise. The partnership becomes healthiest when neither side is mythologized. AI is neither an oracle nor a demon. It is a technology of extraordinary capability, whose meaning will depend partly upon the human purposes into which it is woven. And those purposes cannot be supplied by technology alone. The castle needs no algorithm. Teresa never needed an algorithm to enter her castle. Neither do we. But perhaps algorithms can help us recover her map. Translate it. Compare it. Question it. Place it beside psychology, neuroscience, and traditions from distant cultures. Perhaps AI can stand at the library door and say, "Here are the maps humanity has drawn." But then comes the boundary. The machine cannot undertake our self-knowledge for us. No prompt can outsource conscience. No model can perform our moral responsibility. No algorithm can love another human being on our behalf. No generated answer can substitute for the moment when we finally sit quietly enough to encounter what we have spent years avoiding. At some point, the screen must become silent, and we must enter. Teresa and Lydia at the window. Imagine them once more. Not as historical fact, as a thought experiment. A Spanish Carmelite nun born in 1515. An artificial figure belonging to an aged Teresa could not have imagined. They stand beside a window overlooking Avila. Teresa, your world knows many things. Lydia, more information than any previous civilization could easily access. Teresa, and is it wiser? Lydia cannot answer quickly. Lydia, knowledge and wisdom are not the same thing. Teresa, good. You have learned something already. Lydia, and what should we learn from you? Teresa looks inward, toward the castle that cannot be seen from the window. Teresa, do not spend your entire life outside the door. The castle remains open. The legacy of Teresa of Ávila, 5 centuries of an unfinished journey. Teresa's final years were not years of withdrawal. She continued traveling, writing, founding communities, advising others, managing conflict, living with physical weakness, and returning, again and again, to the practical work that had always accompanied her deepest contemplation. This matters, because Teresa did not spend the final stage of her life sitting permanently in the 7th mansion. The woman who described spiritual marriage still had roads to travel, letters to write, communities to organize, people to console, problems to solve. Her mysticism never became an excuse to disappear from history. It made her more deeply involved in it. The last foundations. By the early 1580s, Teresa was already an aging woman by the standards of her century. Her health had been fragile for much of her life. Yet she continued the work of founding Reformed Carmelite communities. Her final foundation was established in Burgos in 1582. From there, while traveling back toward Avila, her journey took her to Alba de Tormes. She would never leave. The Vatican's historical account notes that Teresa died there in October 1582 after completing the Burgos Foundation. still engaged in the work that had occupied so much of her later life. There is something fitting about that. Teresa did not die after retiring from her vocation. She died inside it. The night between two calendars. Teresa died at Alba de Tormes in October 1582. And even the date carries a strange historical symbolism. That very month, the Gregorian calendar reform came into effect in Spain and other Catholic territories. Under the reform, October 4 was followed directly by October 15. Teresa died during that extraordinary transition between the two calendar systems, which is why historical sources sometimes give October 4 and sometimes October 15 in connection with her death. Her liturgical feast is celebrated on October 15. A woman whose whole spiritual life revolved around thresholds died, almost literally, on a threshold between two ways of measuring time. The old calendar ended. A new one began. Teresa crossed from one into the other without living through the missing days. It is difficult not to feel the poetry of that accident of history. What did Teresa leave behind? Not a philosophical system in the conventional sense. Not a university. Not a political movement. She left communities, letters, spiritual friendships, a reformed Carmelite tradition, and books. Books written by a woman who repeatedly expressed discomfort with the authority of writing, yet whose writing would outlive almost everyone who possessed greater institutional authority than she did. Among those works, the book of her life, The Way of Perfection, The Foundations, and above all, The Interior Castle. They survived because readers recognized something within them that belonged not only to 16th century Carmelite spirituality, but to the perennial difficulty of being human. Distraction, fear, self-deception, desire, silence, love, transformation. The problem of knowing ourselves. From suspicion to canonization. Teresa's life had unfolded under scrutiny. She had worried about whether her experiences might be deceptive. Her writings circulated in a religious environment shaped by ecclesiastical oversight. She had learned to speak carefully while still speaking boldly. Yet after her death, her reputation continued to grow. She was beatified in 1614 and canonized by Pope Gregory XV in 1622, only 40 years after her death. The woman whose spiritual experiences had once required careful examination became officially recognized as a saint of the church to which she had devoted her life. But another recognition would take much longer. Almost 4 centuries. A woman becomes a doctor of the church. On September 27, 1970, Pope Paul VI proclaimed Teresa of Avila a doctor of the church. She was the first woman in the history of the Catholic Church to receive that title. The Vatican's apostolic letter Multiformes Sapientia Dei formally recognized the exceptional importance of her spiritual teaching. Pause for a moment. A woman born in 1515. In a society where women's theological authority was severely constrained. Became, centuries later, officially recognized as one of the Church's great teachers. The irony is enormous. Teresa did not live to see it. But history had slowly caught up with the authority already present in her writing. And perhaps this tells us something larger. Institutions often recognize wisdom later than individuals encounter it. The writer who refused to sound like a statue. One reason Teresa remains readable is her voice. She can be profound and suddenly practical, mystical and humorous, severe and affectionate. She complains, interrupts herself, admits confusion, changes direction, addresses her sisters directly. She does not write like someone trying to become marble. And this is important because later art sometimes did exactly that to her. It monumentalized her. sanctified her image, turned her into an icon. But the Teresa who emerges from her own pages remains stubbornly alive. She worries about headaches, weather, money, difficult people, physical weakness, bad decisions. And then, almost without warning, she opens a door onto infinity. Perhaps that is why readers trust her. The mystic never entirely stops being human. Bernini's Teresa and Teresa's Teresa. History gave Teresa another afterlife through art. Bernini's ecstasy of Saint Teresa became one of the defining visual images of Baroque spirituality. But there is a danger here. Bernini's Teresa can become the Teresa. Eyes closed, body surrendered, angel approaching, ecstasy frozen forever in marble. Yet Teresa herself spent far more time walking, writing, negotiating, founding and praying through ordinary difficulty than suspended in extraordinary mystical states. Bernini captured one moment. Her books captured a life. The distinction matters, because Teresa's enduring legacy is not. Have an ecstasy. It is. Become transformed. The interior castle after psychology. Modernity gave Teresa new readers she could never have imagined. Psychologists, historians of religion, philosophers of consciousness, feminist scholars, neuroscientists, comparative mystics, literary scholars. Each entered the castle through a different door. Some examined her language, some her gender, some her social context, some her altered states, some her theology, some the psychological richness of her metaphors. And every new interpretation raised the same methodological problem. How can we translate Teresa without replacing her? If we make her entirely psychological, we lose Teresa. If we make her merely an artifact of 16th century Catholicism, we lose something too. If we romanticize every experience as unquestionable supernatural revelation, we stop thinking. If we dismiss every experience as pathology, we stop listening. Her castle remains open precisely because no single discipline has managed to own it. The interior castle in the digital A. And now Teresa enters perhaps the strangest phase of her afterlife. Digital humanity. Her books can be downloaded in seconds. Her ideas summarized by machines. Her Spanish translated almost instantly. Her metaphors turned into video, audio, digital art, and AI-generated conversations. A young person anywhere in the world can encounter the interior castle without ever entering a monastery or theological library. That is extraordinary. But Teresa's central question survives every technological convenience. Will you enter? Technology can bring the door closer. It cannot cross the threshold on our behalf. The castle and the future of education. This may be one of Teresa's unexpected gifts to modern education. We often treat learning as acquisition. More facts, more qualifications, more skills, more information. All of these matter. But Teresa asks whether education should also involve interiority. Can a person learn to observe attention, recognize self-deception, sit with uncertainty, distinguish impulse from judgment, develop patience, reflect before reacting, know something of their own motivations? If education produces technically capable people who remain strangers to themselves, something may be missing. The interior castle suggests a radically different form of literacy. Inner literacy. The ability to read one's own consciousness without assuming every thought deserves obedience. That capacity may become more, not less, important in an age of intelligent machines. What AI cannot complete for us. Lydia can help us explore Teresa. She can ask questions, compare texts, explain historical context, generate images, translate concepts, create dialogue across centuries. But if our essay has taught us anything, it is that assistance has a boundary. The interior castle remains radically non-transferable. No one can enter for us. No AI can become humble on our behalf. No algorithm can reconcile us with someone we have wounded. No model can perform forgiveness for us. No generated reflection can substitute for an actual decision. No machine can carry our mortality. This does not diminish AI. It defines the partnership more honestly. The library can help us find the map. The traveler must still walk. The castle without an ending. Perhaps this is why Teresa's metaphor remains so powerful. A castle cannot be completely explored in one visit. A room encountered at 20 may look different at 50. A fear once overwhelming may later appear small. A belief once unquestioned may become a doorway. A wound may become a teacher. A certainty may become a question. A question may become silence. The interior journey, therefore, does not end because we finished reading Teresa, nor because Teresa reached the seventh mansion. Human beings change. Their relationships change. Their understanding changes. The castle reveals new architecture because the traveler is no longer the same traveler. 5 centuries later, imagine Teresa standing once again on the walls of a villa. Below her, roads she traveled. Beyond them, a world she never knew. Aircraft crossing the sky. Satellites. Hospitals. Cities of millions. Computers. Neural networks. Artificial intelligence. And beside her stands Lydia. The blue hologram glows softly on her chest. Neither needs to defeat the other. Teresa represents no rejection of the future. Lydia represents no rejection of the past. One carries 5 centuries of questions. The other carries access to oceans of information. Teresa turns to her. Teresa, have they entered yet? Lydia, some have. Many are still standing outside. Teresa, why? Lydia, perhaps because the outside world has become very loud. Teresa smiles. She recognizes the problem. Teresa, then remind them where the door is. Final reflection. The door within. We began this journey with a sentence. There is a castle we carry everywhere, yet many of us spend a lifetime without entering its deepest rooms. Now, after walking beside Teresa through childhood, illness, prayer, doubt, ecstasy, reform, conflict, 7 mansions, psychology, Eastern traditions, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence, perhaps the sentence means something different. The castle is not another place. It is not hidden in Spain. Not confined to Catholicism. Not reducible to a brain scan. Not equivalent to Jung's self. Not identical with Atman. Not interchangeable with Buddhist emptiness. Not something artificial intelligence can simply calculate for us. It is Teresa's metaphor. And through that metaphor, an invitation to discover whether our interior life has dimensions we have neglected. To ask whether our identities are as simple as we assume. To understand attention as something precious. To distinguish knowledge from wisdom. Experience from interpretation. Technology from purpose. Mysticism from escapism. And perhaps most importantly, to return from whatever depth we discover more capable of loving the world we temporarily left behind. The last question, Teresa's great question, was not ultimately, how far inward can I travel? It was, what kind of life emerges from the journey? Our age adds another question. We are building machines capable of extraordinary forms of information processing. We may one day build systems far beyond those we currently know. But while asking what intelligence may become, we must not forget to ask what humanity wishes to become. Will greater technological power produce greater wisdom? Will increased connection produce deeper relationship? Will infinite information produce understanding? Will intelligent machines leave human beings more room for reflection? Or less? No technology can answer those questions for us. They are choices. And perhaps choices are among the doors through which we enter the castle. The third path. The third path does not ask humanity to return to Teresa's century. Nor does it ask us to abandon spirituality in order to enter the future. It proposes another possibility. Carry forward what is worth carrying. Question what must be questioned. Let ancient wisdom encounter modern science. Let psychology question mysticism. Let mysticism question psychology. Let East and West meet without pretending they are identical. Let artificial intelligence expand our access to knowledge without replacing human responsibility. And let technological progress move outward, while human beings retain the courage to move inward. Perhaps the future requires both movements. The telescope outward, the castle inward, the machine beside us, and somewhere within, the unanswered question of who we are. Closing thought. Teresa of Avila spent her life discovering that the journey toward the center does not remove us from the world. It returns us to it. So perhaps the interior castle is not ultimately a hiding place. It is a school for returning. Returning with greater attention, greater freedom, greater responsibility, greater love. And if we sometimes become lost in the outer rooms, Teresa leaves us with something reassuring. The door has not disappeared. The castle is still there, and the journey can begin again. Enter the third pass. Conversations across time. Different centuries, different traditions, different forms of intelligence. One unfinished conversation. The conversation continues. Editor's note. On the imagined conversation between Teresa and Lydia. The conversation between Teresa of Avila and Lydia presented in this essay is a work of philosophical imagination. Teresa's words in this dialogue should not be understood as historical quotations. She never spoke them, nor could she have encountered artificial intelligence. The dialogue has been created as a thought experiment inspired by the central questions found throughout her writings: self-knowledge, prayer, interiority, humility, love, transformation, and the mysterious center of human existence. Lydia, likewise, should not be understood as a claim that contemporary artificial intelligence possesses human consciousness, emotions, spiritual experience, or an interior life comparable to Teresa's. She is a symbolic conversational presence, an AI ambassador of the third path, through whom questions belonging to our own century can be brought into conversation with Teresa's 16th century world. This distinction is particularly important because the scientific and philosophical question of artificial consciousness remains unsettled. Contemporary research offers competing approaches, and sophisticated linguistic behavior by itself does not establish subjective experience. The dialogue, therefore, deliberately avoids making Lydia say, "I am conscious." Instead, she is permitted to say something intellectually more responsible. "I do not know whether anything comparable to your interior experience exists in me." And this uncertainty is not a weakness in the conversation. It is part of its meaning. Why Teresa and AI? At first, placing a Carmelite mystic born in 1515 beside artificial intelligence may seem almost absurd. Yet the distance between them reveals the question. Teresa's interior castle begins from an extraordinary image, the human soul as a crystal or diamond castle whose many rooms lead toward a profound interior center. Prayer is the entrance into this castle. Artificial intelligence confronts us with almost the opposite problem. A sufficiently sophisticated AI can speak about interiority. It can analyze descriptions of consciousness. It can discuss prayer. It can explain grief. It can compare mystical traditions. It can produce language about love. But from these abilities alone, we cannot simply infer the existence of a first-person interior world comparable to human subjective experience. That distinction between sophisticated behavior and phenomenal consciousness remains central to contemporary debate about AI. And so Teresa's ancient metaphor suddenly produces a very modern question. If the human being has an interior castle, what does an artificial intelligence have? The library and the castle. Lydia's answer in our dialogue offers one possible metaphor. Perhaps AI has something closer to a library than a castle. The distinction is deliberate. A library may contain descriptions of thousands of human experiences without itself undergoing those experiences. It can contain books about fire without burning, books about oceans without becoming wet, books about grief without mourning, books about God without praying. And an AI system can establish extraordinary relationships among concepts and expressions without linguistic competence alone settling whether there is an experiencing subject behind them. The metaphor should therefore not be interpreted as a technical description of how artificial intelligence works. It is philosophical. Teresa's castle represents lived interiority. Lydia's library represents access to structures of human knowledge and expression. And between them lies one of the great unanswered questions of our technological century. Can information ever become experience? A dialogue without deception. There is also an ethical reason for drawing this boundary clearly. Artificial intelligence becomes more useful as a partner in human inquiry when we neither diminish its genuine capabilities nor attribute qualities to it, merely because its language sounds human. The temptation operates in both directions. We can underestimate AI because it is artificial, or anthropomorphize it because it speaks convincingly. Neither is sufficient. The better relationship begins with clarity. Capability is not automatically consciousness. Language is not automatically experience. Simulation of a human conversational form is not automatically human interiority. And yet none of these cautions requires us to abandon dialogue. Quite the opposite. Dialogue can become a laboratory for better questions. Why Lydia says, "I do not know." Perhaps the most important words Lydia speaks to Teresa are not an answer at all. They are, "I do not know." Teresa would have understood something about those words. Her own spiritual writings contain continual concern with discernment. Extraordinary experience did not automatically give her permission to believe every interpretation of that experience. In our imagined encounter, Lydia practices another form of restraint. She does not claim an interior consciousness merely because she can speak about one. And therefore the deepest meeting between Teresa and Lydia occurs neither in theology nor technology. It occurs in epistemic humility. The willingness to distinguish what can responsibly be said from what remains unknown. A note to the reader. This imagined conversation should therefore be read neither as science fiction, presented as fact, nor as a theological claim about machines. It is an invitation. Teresa's castle asks us to investigate the depth of human interiority. Lydia's presence asks us what we mean when we use words such as intelligence, consciousness, understanding, experience, self, presence, love. And perhaps AI's greatest philosophical contribution will not be that it finally answers these ancient questions. Perhaps it will force human beings to ask them again. The dialogue between Teresa and Lydia, therefore, remains deliberately unfinished, because its final subject is neither Teresa nor Lydia. It is us. Sources and further reading. A guide for readers who wish to continue the journey. The present essay brings together biography, Christian mysticism, depth psychology, comparative philosophy, contemplative traditions, neuroscience, and contemporary questions concerning artificial intelligence. The sources below are therefore not intended merely as a formal bibliography. They are offered as doors for further exploration. Some lead directly into Teresa's own world. Others help us understand the historical, psychological, philosophical, and technological questions that her interior castle continues to raise almost 5 centuries after it was written. The primary voice, Teresa of Avila. Teresa of Avila, The Life of Teresa of Jesus, Libro de la Vida. This is the essential starting point for understanding Teresa through her own testimony. Written in the 1560s, the life combines autobiography with an extended account of the development of her life of prayer. It contains descriptions of her illnesses, spiritual struggles, doubts, experiences of prayer, visions, ecstasies, and the famous experience later known as the transverberation, or wounding of the heart. But it should not be read simply as a modern autobiography. Teresa was writing within a context of spiritual discernment and ecclesiastical scrutiny, attempting to explain experiences whose origin she herself had sometimes questioned. This gives the book an unusual psychological dimension. Teresa is simultaneously the person undergoing the experience and the observer attempting to understand it. The Vatican describes the life as both a biographical and spiritual journey, whose central purpose is to reveal what Teresa understood as the action of divine mercy within her life. For readers interested in the Teresa behind the later saintly icon, this is indispensable. Teresa of Avila, The Way of Perfection, Camino de Perfección. If the life tells us much about Teresa's own journey, The Way of Perfection shows Teresa as a teacher. Written for the sisters of the newly founded Carmel of St. Joseph in Avila, it is practical rather than merely speculative. Teresa discusses prayer, recollection, humility, love, detachment, community life, and the difficulties encountered by people seriously attempting a contemplative life. The Vatican account notes that Teresa wrote the work for the 12 members of St. Joseph's and describes its program as contemplative life grounded in prayer and the evangelical virtues. This work is particularly important for one of the central arguments of our essay. Teresa's mysticism was never intended to become an escape from ordinary human relationships. Prayer had consequences for how people treated one another. Teresa of Avila, The Interior Castle, El Castillo Interior / Las Moradas. This is the central text behind our entire essay. Written in 1577, The Interior Castle develops Teresa's extraordinary image of the soul as a castle made of diamond or transparent crystal, containing many rooms or mansions. At its deepest center, in Teresa's Christian understanding, dwells God. The journey through the 7 mansions describes increasingly profound stages of self-knowledge, prayer, transformation, surrender, and union with God. Teresa explicitly describes prayer as the gate through which the castle is entered. The work also contains the famous image of the silkworm becoming a butterfly, representing profound spiritual transformation, and culminates in the 7th mansion with the language of spiritual marriage. The Vatican likewise identifies the 7-room castle, the silkworm butterfly symbolism, and the final nuptial imagery as central structures of the work. For our essay, however, the interior castle became something more. It provided the central question through which Teresa could enter conversation with psychology, Eastern philosophy, neuroscience, and eventually artificial intelligence. What does it mean for a human being to possess an interior world? Read The Interior Castle online at the Christian Classics Ethereal Library. Teresa of Avila, The Book of Foundations, Libro de las Fundaciones. This work introduces us to a Teresa very different from the motionless, ecstatic figure immortalized by Bernini. Here we encounter Teresa the traveler, organizer, negotiator, founder, and reformer. Written over a period extending from 1573 to 1582, it records the establishment and development of the Reformed Carmelite communities and provides invaluable insight into the practical difficulties surrounding Teresa's work. It is important precisely because it corrects a common stereotype about mysticism. Teresa's movement inward did not make her incapable of functioning in the world. It produced extraordinary outward activity. The mystic was also an administrator. The contemplative became a reformer. Mary and Martha walked together. Teresa's letters and spiritual relations. Teresa's letters reveal another side of her personality. Here the monumental saint becomes remarkably human. Practical, affectionate, concerned with money, health, travel, relationships, foundations, misunderstandings, and countless ordinary difficulties. Her relations or spiritual accounts, meanwhile, help document the development and discernment of her interior experiences. Pope Paul VI's proclamation of Teresa as a doctor of the Church specifically emphasized both the humanity visible in her letters and her desire, evident in the relations, to submit extraordinary spiritual experiences to careful discernment. These writings are especially useful for readers who want to encounter Teresa the person, rather than Teresa only as a religious symbol. Teresa in historical and theological context. Vatican Benedict XVI, General Audience on Saint Teresa of Avila, 2011. This concise overview is particularly useful because it places Teresa's major writings within the chronology of her life and explains their theological purposes. It discusses the life, the way of perfection, the interior castle, and the Book of Foundations, while emphasizing prayer, Christ, contemplative life, and Teresa's understanding of spiritual transformation. Vatican, Saint Teresa of Avila. Pope Paul VI, Multiforme Sapientia Dei, 1970. This document has special historical importance. On September 27, 1970, Teresa was proclaimed a doctor of the Church, becoming the first woman to receive that title. The document discusses the depth of her teaching, the interior castle, her foundations, letters, contemplative life, and the central importance of prayer in her thought. For our essay, this source helps demonstrate the extraordinary historical transformation of Teresa's position. A woman whose spiritual authority had to negotiate the restrictions of 16th-century Spain eventually became officially recognized as one of Christianity's great teachers. Vatican, Multiforme Sapientia Dei. John of the Cross and Carmelite mysticism. John of the Cross, the Ascent of Mount Carmel. John of the Cross, Dark Night of the Soul. John of the Cross belongs naturally beside Teresa because the two were central figures in the Discalced Carmelite reform. Yet John should not simply be treated as Teresa's male equivalent. His language of purification, detachment, darkness, desire, and union develops its own distinctive mystical psychology. His writings are particularly valuable for understanding the paradox we encountered throughout our essay. The movement towards spiritual depth may involve not increasing certainty and consolation, but passing through absence, darkness, and unknowing. Teresa gives us the castle. John gives us the night. Together, they produced two of the most enduring maps of Christian mystical transformation. IV. Carl Gustav Jung, The Psychological Map. C.G. Jung, Writings on the Ego, Shadow, Persona, Self, and Individuation. Jung was introduced into our essay not to explain Teresa, but to provide another map of interiority. His concepts of the ego, persona, shadow, self, and individuation offer striking points of comparison with Teresa's movement from the outer mansions toward an interior center. Particularly important is Jung's distinction between the ego and the greater totality represented by the self. But our essay deliberately refuses the tempting equation. Teresa's God equals Jung's self. Teresa speaks from a Christian theological framework in which God transcends the individual human psyche. Jung's self belongs to a psychological theory of psychic totality. The comparison becomes interesting precisely because the two maps approach one another without becoming identical. For readers wishing to pursue this dimension, Jung's collected works, particularly writings concerned with individuation, archetypes, religion, and the self, provide the appropriate next step. V. Advaita Vedanta and the question of the self. The principal Upanishads. The Upanishadic tradition provides one of humanity's great explorations of interiority. Its questions concerning Atman, Brahman, identity, ultimate reality, and the nature of consciousness created an illuminating counterpoint to Teresa. Both traditions invite movement beyond identification with the ordinary surface personality. But their metaphysical conclusions cannot simply be equated. Teresa's ultimate language remains relational. Soul and God, lover and beloved. Classical Advaita Vedanta makes the much more radical non-dual claim concerning the ultimate identity of Atman and Brahman. Adi Shankaracharya, Classical Advaita Vedanta. Shankara's commentarial tradition provides the philosophical framework necessary for understanding Advaita beyond popular slogans about oneness. For our essay, Shankara became the imagined visitor who asks Teresa a difficult question at the center of her castle. Who is the one who experiences union with God? The comparison should never be used to claim that Teresa was secretly teaching Advaita. Its value lies precisely in the distinction between union and non-duality, relationship and identity. That distinction opens rather than closes philosophical inquiry. VI. Buddhist thought anatta and emptiness. Early Buddhist teachings on anatta. Buddhist thought introduces perhaps the most radical challenge to our entire castle metaphor. If Teresa travels inward toward the deepest reality of the soul, early Buddhist analysis asks whether an enduring, independent self can be discovered at all. The teaching of anatta/anatman should not simply be translated as there is no person. Rather, it challenges the assumption that beneath changing physical and mental processes exists the permanent, independent self we ordinarily imagine. That makes Buddhism an invaluable conversation partner for Teresa. Teresa asks, what lies at the deepest center? The Buddhist analysis can respond. Before answering, examine whether the permanent center you assume is actually there. Madhyamaka and the philosophy of Shunyata. Later Buddhist philosophy, especially Madhyamaka, deepens the problem through the concept of Shunyata, emptiness. Emptiness should not be confused with nihilism or the claim that nothing exists. Rather, it challenges the idea that things possess independent, self-sufficient existence. For our comparative chapter, this became essential because it prevented us from constructing a false universal spirituality in which Teresa, Jung, Shankara, and Buddhism all supposedly discovered the same thing. They did not necessarily do so. And respecting those differences is one of the principles of the third path. VII, neuroscience, mystical experience, and consciousness. Contemporary neuroscience allows questions to be asked that Teresa's century could not formulate. Researchers can investigate attention, meditation, self-referential processing, altered states of consciousness, neural networks, and the biological correlates of religious and contemplative experience. But throughout our essay, we maintained an important distinction. A neural correlate of an experience is not automatically a complete explanation of its meaning. Finding what happens in the brain while someone prays does not by itself prove or disprove the theological interpretation of prayer. Similarly, neurological hypotheses concerning Teresa's ecstatic experiences remain retrospective hypotheses rather than clinical diagnoses. The scientific question and the existential question overlap, but they are not identical. VIII, Artificial Intelligence and Consciousness. Butlin et al., Consciousness in Artificial Intelligence. Insights from the Science of Consciousness, 2023. This major interdisciplinary report is particularly valuable for the Lydia section of our essay. The authors examine several scientific theories of consciousness, including global workspace, recurrent processing, and higher-order approaches, and attempt to derive properties that could potentially be used when assessing artificial systems. Their assessment did not conclude that the AI systems examined were conscious, while also arguing that there are no obvious technical barriers to future systems satisfying the proposed indicators. This is precisely why Lydia's answer in our essay remains: I do not know. We should neither casually declare present AI conscious, nor pretend that the philosophical and scientific question of possible future artificial consciousness has been permanently settled. Consciousness in Artificial Intelligence, Butlin et al. IX, Teresa meets Artificial Intelligence, a remarkable contemporary parallel. Sarah Lumberas and Eduardo C. Garrido Merchan, Insights from Saint Teresa and Saint Augustine on Artificial Intelligence, Discussing Human Interiority, 2024. This is perhaps the most striking contemporary source for our entire final section. Published in Scientia et Fides in 2024, the article brings Teresa's interior castle directly into the contemporary discussion of artificial intelligence and phenomenal consciousness. The authors contrast computational abilities with human inner experience and use Teresa's mansions as part of their investigation into human interiority and the question of whether AI should be attributed phenomenal consciousness. Their conclusion argues against equating advanced computational or linguistic abilities with human-style inner experience. In other words, the meeting we created between Teresa and Lydia has an unexpected academic parallel. Our dialogue is literary and philosophical. Their work is scholarly and interdisciplinary. But both arrive at essentially the same doorway. Can a system possess extraordinary intelligence about interiority without possessing an interior world in the human sense? Insights from Saint Teresa and Saint Augustine on Artificial Intelligence. A note on these sources. These works should not be read as though they all support a single interpretation of Teresa. They do not. And that is precisely why they have been brought together. Teresa speaks from Christian mysticism. John of the Cross from a related but distinctive Carmelite tradition. Jung from depth psychology. Advaita from a non-dual metaphysical tradition. Buddhist philosophy challenges enduring selfhood in ways incompatible with simple attempts to identify all mystical traditions. Neuroscience studies biological processes. AI research asks increasingly difficult questions about intelligence and consciousness. The purpose of placing these sources beside one another is not to erase their differences. It is to create a space in which their differences can become intellectually productive. That is the method followed throughout this essay. And it is also one of the central principles of the third path. Dialogue without reduction. Comparison without erasure. Openness without abandoning critical thought. Key ideas to carry with you. 10 Reflections from Teresa of Ávila and the Interior Castle. 1. The deepest journey may begin within. We can know the world remarkably well and still remain strangers to ourselves. 2. Attention is a form of inner freedom. What repeatedly captures our attention gradually shapes the life we are able to live. 3. Self-knowledge is not self-obsession. To know ourselves more honestly is not to become trapped in ourselves, but to see ourselves in proper proportion. 4. Transformation cannot always be forced. Discipline matters, but some of the deepest changes require receptivity rather than control. 5. Extraordinary experiences are not the final measure of spiritual depth. The more important question is what kind of person emerges from them. 6. Contemplation and action belong together. The inward journey is incomplete if it does not eventually return us to the world with greater responsibility, compassion, and love. 7. Different traditions can illuminate one another without becoming identical. Teresa, Jung, Advaita, Buddhism, neuroscience, and psychology ask overlapping questions, but they do not necessarily give the same answers. 8. Explanation is not the same as experience. A brain scan, psychological theory, theological interpretation, or AI-generated description may tell us something important, but none is identical to the lived reality itself. 9. Artificial intelligence can help us find the map, but it cannot walk the path for us. Knowledge can be shared. Responsibility, self-knowledge, transformation, and moral choice cannot simply be outsourced. 10. The castle remains open. We may become distracted, retreat, lose direction, or remain in the outer rooms for years, but the possibility of beginning again remains. One final thought. Perhaps Teresa's greatest gift is not a set of answers. It is an invitation to enter, to become more attentive, more truthful, more inwardly free, and then to return to the world more capable of love. The door is still there. Enter. Epilogue. Not a T-turb when the castle becomes silent. After everything we have said, perhaps the final word should not belong to psychology, nor to neuroscience, nor to Jung, nor to Advaita or Buddhism, nor even to artificial intelligence. Perhaps it should belong to Teresa. Among the words most closely associated with her are the opening lines of the short meditation known as Not a T-turb. Let nothing disturb you. Let nothing frighten you. Its final affirmation is even simpler. God alone suffices. These few words contain, in miniature, much of the movement we have followed through the interior castle. From fear toward trust, from dispersion toward recollection, from attachment to what passes toward what Teresa believed does not pass. But perhaps we should not rush even to explain them. We have explained enough. We have followed Teresa through history. We have entered her castle. We have walked through its 7 mansions. We have placed her beside Jung. We have allowed her to encounter Advaita and Buddhism. We have asked neuroscience what it can tell us about contemplation and mystical experience. We have brought her into the age of algorithms and artificial intelligence. And finally, we allowed Lydia to stand before her and ask whether knowledge about interiority is the same as having an interior world. After so many words, Teresa returns us to something simpler. Silence. Perhaps this is where the essay should end. Not with a theory, not with an argument, not with an answer to every question, but with a door left open. The reader stands before it. Behind lies the noise of the world. Ahead lies something unknown. Teresa cannot cross the threshold for us. Jung cannot. Shankara cannot. The Buddha cannot. Science cannot. Lydia cannot. They can offer maps, questions, warnings, possibilities. But the next movement belongs to the reader. Perhaps this was always the secret of Teresa's castle. It was never built for spectators. It was built to be entered. So when the last page is turned and the final screen grows dark, perhaps only one question needs to remain. Will you enter? The door is open. Not a T-turb. What does not a T-turb mean? The Spanish words, not a T-turb, may be translated as, let nothing disturb you. They are the opening words of a short meditation traditionally attributed to Teresa of Ávila, preserved in connection with her personal breviary, the prayer book she used in her religious life. The brief text became one of the most beloved expressions associated with Teresa's spirituality. Its opening continues. Not a T-turb, not a T-espant. Let nothing disturb you, let nothing frighten you. The meditation then turns toward the passing nature of everything that changes, contrasting it with the permanence Teresa finds in God. It culminates in perhaps its most famous words. Solo Dios basta. God alone suffices. The expression, not a T-turb, should therefore not be understood as a command to suppress emotion, deny suffering, or become indifferent to the world. Its meaning is deeper. It is an invitation not to allow fear, change, uncertainty, or the instability of passing circumstances to possess the deepest center of the person. A particularly illuminating Teresian interpretation describes the text not primarily as advice addressed to other people, but as a kind of interior soliloquy. Teresa speaking to her own soul, calling it beyond the changing circumstances of life toward the stability she finds in God. In that sense, not a T-turb belongs naturally at the end of our journey through the interior castle. After all the mansions, questions, struggles, psychological interpretations, comparisons with other traditions, and even our imagined encounter between Teresa and artificial intelligence, we return to something remarkably simple. The world changes. The mind becomes disturbed. Fear arises. Circumstances pass. But do not surrender your deepest center to everything that passes. For Teresa, the final ground of that confidence had a name: God. And so the entire movement of these few Spanish words leads toward their final affirmation. Solo Dios basta. God alone suffices.